Chapter 4795. The two beast overlords were called Jadefall and Illusionary. Both of them had lived for nearly 100,000 years and were divine beasts born in the primordial era. They had unique talents and remarkable strength. Both of them were intermediate god emperor, but one of them had condensed 5 Daoist rhymes, while the other had condensed 6. Bai Luo and Su Sheng had more than 100 billion divine beasts, mutated beasts, and ferocious beasts under their command. They could quickly gather thousands of divine king realm beasts. The God-Slayer worship had entered the territory of these two overlords. The white dragon was naturally cautious and did not dare to be careless. However, some things were destined to happen. There was no avoiding them. Before Overlord Song Lu died, Bai Luo and Su Sheng received the message he sent before he died. At the time, Bai Luo and Su Sheng were leading thousands of divine king elites toward the south, preparing to kill Ji Tianxing. However, when they learned that Overlord Song Lu had tried to kill Kenshin alone and had fallen into a desperate situation, they changed their minds on the spot. The two of them quickly contacted each other and urgently discussed countermeasures. It was useless to continue heading south. By the time they arrived, Kenshin would have already left. According to Kenshin's route, he was heading north. In other words, Bai Luo and Su Sheng did not need to actively seek out Kenshin. They only needed to set up ambushes along Kenshin's path and wait for him to come. Moreover, Kenshin had already killed 3 of the 5 beast overlords. Reality proved that no one was Kenshin's match. Anyone who fought him alone would be killed. Even if Bai Luo and Su Sheng were confident that they were stronger than overlords Yong Qian and Song Lu, it was useless. There were already 3 precedents, so how could they dare to gamble with their lives? The best way to deal with this was for them to work together and set up ambushes along Kenshin's path in advance, waiting for Kenshin to walk right into their trap. Bai Luo and Su Sheng hit it off immediately. They quickly changed their strategy and put it into action. Half a day later, the two of them gathered together and began to set up an inescapable net, as well as a formation to detect Kenshin's whereabouts and various traps. The 6,000 god kings under the two of them were split into several dozen groups and sent out. They formed a long line of defense in the vast forest and mountains. Although there were only a few dozen beast race god kings in each troop, it was impossible for them to stop Kenshin with their strength and methods. However, Bai Luo and Su Sheng had ordered them to report the Kenshin's whereabouts as soon as they discovered them. He did not expect them to intercept or obstruct Kenshin. As long as they could find Kenshin, it would be a great achievement. In addition, Bai Luo and Su Sheng also used their innate abilities to search for the God-Slayer worship and Kenshin. After 9 days of preparation, their arrangements were quite adequate, and they were finally seeing results. At this moment, the monarch of Jadefall was patrolling the Cloud Sea with a group of guards, his divine sense covering an area of 200,000 kilometers. At the same time, he also used his innate ability, God's Eye, to carefully observe the situation within 100,000 kilometers. Even if Kenshin could hide his presence and escape his divine sense, there was no way he could escape his innate ability, God's Eye. Just as expected, when he flew over a majestic mountain range, his divine sense detected a faint wisp of divine power 100,000 kilometers to the south. If the monarch of Jadefall was careless, he would not have noticed that wisp of divine power and would definitely have missed it. However, he was very cautious and predicted that Kenshin would likely arrive today. Thus, he used his innate ability, God's Eye, to carefully observe the scene in the southern sky. Soon, its ink-blue eyes saw through all the disguises. It discovered that a divine worship was speeding toward them from 100,000 miles to the south. Without any hesitation, the monarch of Jadefall immediately determined that it was Kenshin's worship. He hurriedly sent out a message and called for Su Sheng's help. Meanwhile, it had used a secret technique to hide itself and the 100 God King guards. It had concealed all of its divine power. He stealthily approached the God-Slayer worship with his guards, but he was not in a hurry to appear or attack. Seeing the God-Slayer worship getting closer and closer to the north, he hurriedly followed. The God-Slayer worship was very fast, but the monarch of Jadefall was not slow either. Even though he had 100 guards and had to cast a spell to hide his presence, He was not shaken off by the God-Slayer worship and continued to follow closely. Unfortunately, Bai Long, who was piloting the God-Slayer worship, had yet to break through to the God-Emperor realm. The difference in strength between him and the monarch of Jadefall was too great. He was focused on piloting the warship and did not realize that the monarch of Jadefall had been secretly following behind. Just like that, the God-Slayer warship flew forward for about 15 minutes, crossing hundreds of mountains. At this time, the monarch of Jadefall finally arrived with a group of god kings. He appeared to the right of the God-Slayer warship, and when he was still 200,000 kilometers away, the monarch of Jadefall sensed him. Without any hesitation, he immediately attacked. The monarch of Jadefall followed behind the God-Slayer warship about 30,000 kilometers away. He exerted all his strength and suddenly released more than 30 blades of divine light toward the God-Slayer warship. The 100 or so god kings behind him also joined forces to unleash secret arts, filling the sky with light and shadows that rained down like a torrential downpour. The monarch of Jadefall was piloting the God-Slayer warship, looking around to see if there was anything out of the ordinary. He had never thought that there would be a sudden attack from the empty sea of clouds behind the battleship. The two sides were too close. By the time he sensed the danger, it was already too late to dodge. At this critical moment, only the God-Slayer warship's barrier of divine light could block those attacks. Bam, bam, bam. In the next instant, the sky full of divine light and sharp blades slammed into the God-Slayer warship's barrier of divine light, creating a deafening explosion. The barrier of divine light shook violently from the impact. Dense cracks appeared on its surface, and countless fragments of divine light flew out. The attacks of the beast race godly monarchs did not cause much damage. However, the monarch of Jadefall's attacks were too sharp and immediately shattered the barrier of the God-Slayer warship. The powerful impact caused the God-Slayer warship to deviate several hundred kilometers to the right. The monarch of Jadefall reacted quickly. Without hesitation, he controlled the God-Slayer warship to form a new barrier. At the same time, he also woke up his master, who was cultivating in seclusion. After receiving the news, Ji Tianxing hurriedly left the distorted spacetime and appeared in the cockpit of the God-Slayer warship. He had already mentally prepared himself and guessed that he would very likely encounter the monarch of Jadefall and the monarch of Jadefall in the next few days. Since the monarch of Jadefall had woken him up in such a hurry, it went without saying that the monarch of God Emperor had attacked them. As expected, Ji Tianxing scanned with his divine sense and discovered the monarch of Jadefall and the 100 or so god kings behind him. Without another word, he ordered the monarch of Jadefall to steer the God-Slayer warship north. He charged out of the God-Slayer warship and summoned the Sword of Burial of Heaven, charging toward the monarch of Jadefall with killing intent. Chapter 4796. Ji Tianxing had long since guessed that Jadefall and Illusionary Overlord would work together to kill him. Although he could only detect Jadefall's presence, he didn't sense Illusionary Overlord's presence. However, he guessed that Illusionary Overlord should be on his way here and would arrive soon. Thus, he didn't want to waste time with Jadefall. He immediately attacked and had the God-Slayer battleship speed up. As long as the God-Slayer battleship could escape safely, he was confident that he could escape quickly and shake off Jadefall. This was the right decision. Ji Tianxing brandished the Burial of Heaven and used a divine art. He clashed with Jadefall and sent him flying back nearly 50 kilometers. Over 100 beast race deity kings surrounded Ji Tianxing, unleashing all sorts of divine arts to attack him. However, Ji Tianxing easily blocked the attack and remained unharmed. He casually punched out a mountain-sized dragon-elephant fist shadow, and then swung out a sword light, and those beast race god kings were beaten to a pulp. After exchanging 2 more blows, over 30 beast race god kings had been slain, and close to 40 beast race god kings had been heavily injured. Suzerain Jadefall was going all out, and yet, she was no match for Ji Tianxing. After 3 exchanges, she didn't even gain the upper hand. Her face was ashen, and her aura was weak as she was sent flying back 100 kilometers. He knew he wasn't Ji Tianxing's match, so he didn't dare fight Ji Tianxing head-on. He could only try his best to stall Ji Tianxing and buy time for Illusionary Overlord to arrive. He silently prayed that Illusionary Overlord would come to his aid before all his guards were killed. Clearly, the 100 or so guards around him were nothing more than cannon fodder to stall for time. However, Ji Tianxing saw through Jade Fall's intentions with a single glance. Seeing that it was no longer fighting head-on, but was blindly wandering and circling around, he decisively withdrew. In any case, the Godslayer battleship was already 80,000 kilometers away. Neither Jade Fall nor the Beast Race God Kings could easily catch up. Shua! Ji Tianxing transformed into a stream of light and tore through the sky, chasing after the God-slaying battleship. However, after 3 breaths, his expression changed. To the front and right of the God-slaying battleship, there was a dazzling divine light that was rapidly approaching from about 100,000 kilometers away. Many figures were wrapped in the divine light, and there was also a powerful divine power aura. Ji Tianxing used his divine sense to probe the divine light and immediately realized that it was most likely the illusory overlord. He had already guessed this would happen, but he did not expect the illusionary overlord to come so quickly. As he sped up and chased after the god-slaying battleship, many thoughts flashed through his mind. Even if Jade Fall and Su Sheng are working together, they shouldn't be this close to each other. They must have split up to investigate my whereabouts. After exchanging a few blows with Lord Jade Fall, Lord Illusionary arrived in less than 10 breaths of time. Things weren't as simple as they seemed. Jade Fall had probably discovered the Godslayer battleship long ago and sent a message to Jade Fall Overlord. However, he wasn't in a hurry to make a move. Instead, he concealed his presence and stealthily followed behind the God-slaying battleship. With White Dragon's strength, it was impossible for him to detect Jade Fall's presence. Only when Jade Fall Overlord arrived and was very close did Jade Fall decide to make a move. In the blink of an eye, Ji Tianxing guessed the reason and deduced Jade Fall's strategy. He also realized that Jade Fall and Jade Fall were stronger and more capable than the previous 3 overlords. They would definitely be more difficult to deal with. White Dragon steered the god-slaying battleship away from the battlefield. After shaking off Jade Fall and the Beast Race God Kings, he slowed down. He was waiting for his master to return. Once his master entered the battleship, they would leave together. In just a few breaths of time, Ji Tianxing caught up to the god-slaying battleship. White Dragon had thought that his master would enter the battleship and appear in the control room. He had already made preparations. When his master appeared behind him, he would have the god-slaying battleship accelerate at full speed. However, Ji Tianxing didn't enter the battleship, nor did he stop. Instead, he sped up and flew forward. He even used a teleportation technique to move 30,000 kilometers away, pulling away from the god-slaying battleship. White Dragon was somewhat puzzled. He wanted to ask his master what was going on. At that moment, a dazzling divine light appeared in the sky 60,000 kilometers away. Many tall figures could be vaguely seen amidst the dazzling multicolored light, as well as violent fluctuations of divine power. White Dragon paused, then understood his master's intentions. That's another beast overlord, Jade Fall. That's right, it's working with Jade Fall. It's rushing over to help. Master was afraid that I wouldn't know and would be attacked by Jade Fall again, so he sped up and rushed ahead. With White Dragon's intelligence, he immediately understood the crux of the matter. However, he was somewhat worried and couldn't help but furrow his brow. He had full confidence in his master's ability to deal with Jade Fall and Jade Fall alone. However, with 2 beast overlords working together and leading a group of beast godly monarchs, he couldn't be sure of the outcome. However, now wasn't the time to think about these problems. Since the enemy was already in front of him, his master had to meet them. The battle was about to begin. The only thing White Dragon could do was focus, activate the battleship's divine robe, and prepare to attack. 360 cannon barrels extended from both sides of the battleship. Dazzling divine light lit up within them, accumulating violent power. At the same time, the divine robe locked onto the divine light tens of thousands of kilometers away, ready to attack at any time. Break! Ji Tianxing was still 10,000 kilometers away from the divine light. He let out a cold shout, swinging the Burial of Heaven to attack first. He used his ultimate technique, sword piercing the 9 heavens. He released a giant golden sword that was 3,000 meters long and slashed at the divine light. The divine light enveloped over 1,000 tall figures. They were the Jade Fall Overlord and 1,000 beast god kings. The Jade Fall Overlord was the strongest of the 5 overlords. He had condensed 6 Daoist rhymes and had over 90,000 years of cultivation. He looked like a black cloud the size of a mountain, but in reality he looked a bit like a black bear with 3 hooves and a single horn on his forehead. He had a large bloody mouth and looked quite menacing. Seeing Ji Tianxing attack first, the Jade Fall Overlord roared angrily and released vast amounts of divine power, making the divine light barrier even more solid. This wasn't just to protect himself, but also to protect the 1,000 beast god kings behind him. He wasn't afraid of sacrificing his beast god kings, but not now. In the next moment, the giant golden sword that was thousands of feet long slashed at the divine light shield with a loud boom that spread for tens of thousands of miles. This wasn't surprising. The giant golden sword shattered and turned into specks of golden light. That giant divine light barrier was also shattered into pieces. 7017K. Chapter 4797. After the divine light shattered, thousands of shards of divine light fell from the sky, dazzling and dazzling. The illusionary ruler and the 1,000 beast race god kings under its command lost the protection of the divine light and were exposed to the sky. Ji Tianxing did not hide his presence or aura because he did not want to scatter his divine power. He wanted to unleash his greatest power and crush the illusionary ruler and the 1,000 beast race god kings under its command head-on. Only by carving out a path of blood and never looking back would he be able to lead everyone out of the encirclement of the 2 beast race lords. Apocalyptic sword. Ji Tianxing had just slashed apart the barrier of divine light and dispelled the defenses of the illusionary ruler and the beast race god kings when he used a trump card to attack the illusionary ruler. The golden sword of light that was hundreds of thousands of feet long appeared and locked onto the illusionary ruler with an unstoppable momentum as it slashed down from the sky. At this moment, it was as if the sun was hanging in the sky, shining with boundless golden light. Everything within tens of thousands of miles was illuminated in a dazzling light. The supreme divine might and heaven-reaching sword intent filled the beast race god kings with fear and made them tremble. Unfortunately, their strength was too low. They could not block this sword, nor could they dodge it. At this critical moment, they could only rely on their lord. When the illusionary ruler sensed the might of the apocalyptic sword, its first reaction was to dodge and run. It knew very well that it could not block the sword. If it was struck, it would be heavily injured even if it did not die. However, it might not be able to dodge, and even if it did, the beast race god kings behind it would suffer heavy casualties. Thus, the illusionary ruler did not hesitate and made the wisest choice. It released several mountain-sized balls of light. There were flames, lightning, and even inky blue balls of light. They contained thousands of divine Dao laws and 3 types of Dao energy. The 3 massive balls of light were like cannonballs as they slammed toward the apocalyptic sword. At the same time, the 1,000 beast race god kings worked together to form a massive shield of light under its lead. It was not a barrier of divine light but a wall-like shield of light that blocked in front of everyone to block the might of the apocalyptic sword. Bang, bang, bang. In the next moment, the 3 huge balls of light smashed into the Armageddon sword, creating a deafening sound. The sword of annihilation that was tens of thousands of feet long was not defeated. It continued to move forward courageously. Like a giant blade that could split the sky and earth, it slashed down towards the crowd. However, the 3 balls of light were shattered. Millions of fragments of divine light splashed out like a torrential flood, pouring down towards the ground, mountains, and rivers. Boom! The Armageddon sword, whose power had been weakened by 30%, struck the light shield with a loud bang, causing another earth-shattering explosion. The 5-colored light shield was shattered on the spot, exploding with dazzling divine light like fireworks. The power of the World Destroyer sword decreased by another 20%, and the light became much dimmer. However, The Armageddon sword, which still had half of its power, slashed into the crowd, causing a bloodbath. At least half of the beast god kings were affected. They were struck by the giant golden sword and struck by the destructive sword Qi. Another 300 or so beast god kings were killed on the spot. Not even their corpses remained. The other 100 or so beast god kings were heavily injured by the giant sword. Some of them had lost limbs, and their bodies were drenched in blood. The illusionary lord, who bore the brunt of the attack, did not fare any better than the god kings under its command. It bore most of the power of the giant sword. Its protective divine light was shattered, and its entire left leg was severed. If only its left front leg was severed, it could still pick up the severed leg and find an opportunity to reattach it in the future. However, the sword intent of the Armageddon sword was too violent. It blew its entire severed leg to smithereens, causing blood to rain down. The heavily injured illusionary lord let out a furious roar of pain, but it was drowned out by the deafening sound. Apart from the wounds on its body, there was also an extremely sharp sword Qi that entered its body through the wounds. It was rampaging through its body, slicing its meridians and bones. The heart-wrenching pain caused the illusionary lord to tremble. It could not help but let out a series of screams. It had no time to save the beast god kings. It hurriedly circulated its divine power to suppress its injuries and expel the sword Qi in its body. Just a moment ago, these beast god kings had been brimming with killing intent. They had formed a battle formation with over 1,000 of them. Who would have thought that Ji Tianxing would only use a single move to beat them into a pulp, leaving them in such a miserable state? 80,000 kilometers away, the Duke of Jade Heaven and several dozen beast god kings witnessed this scene with their own eyes. Their hearts were filled with shock and disbelief. They had never imagined that a mid-stage god emperor stage foreign youth would be able to unleash such terrifying power. Fortunately, the sword god did not use this move when dealing with them previously. Otherwise, the consequences would have been unimaginable. With this in mind, the Duke of Jade Heaven broke out in a cold sweat. At this moment, the white dragon saw that his master had slashed open a massive hole in the beast god tribe battle formation. The surviving beast race god kings, including the illusionary horde lord, were all busy treating the injured. It was a complete mess. If they didn't escape now, when would they? The white dragon also believed that his master would rather him escape with the battleship than stay behind and fight alongside him. And so, the white dragon controlled the god-slaying battleship. It glowed with dazzling divine light as it pushed its speed to the limit and charged toward the hole. Ji Tianxing was swinging the sword of burial of heaven to launch a second attack. When he saw the white dragon's actions, he thought to himself, "This child is worth teaching." Just as the white dragon thought, this was exactly his plan. In front of him was the illusionary lord and several hundred beast god kings. Behind him was the Duke of Jade Heaven and several dozen god kings. Once he was surrounded, even if he did not die, he would be held back. The best choice was to take advantage of this opportunity to escape. The god-slaying battleship turned into a streak of light and crossed 10,000 kilometers. It was about to pass through the hole. At this critical moment, the illusionary lord's aura was locked onto by Ji Tianxing and was about to be struck by a few more devastating sword Qi. The illusionary lord had no spare energy to stop the god-slaying battleship. As for the several hundred beast god kings, most of them were filled with fear and panic. They had yet to recover from their shock. Helpless, the illusionary lord could only use all his strength to neutralize Ji Tianxing's attacks. He roared and issued an order. "Stop that battleship for this emperor." The illusionary lord recognized that Ji Tianxing was Kenshin, the legendary chosen one. Logically speaking, the illusionary lord and the Duke of Jade Heaven only needed to capture Kenshin and ignore that battleship. However, the two lords had complex thoughts and were even more shrewd. They were certain that there must be an important reason why Kenshin had personally appeared and attacked while covering that battleship's escape. Since that was the case, not only did they have to capture Kenshin, but they also had to stop that battleship and capture it in one fell swoop. /book_15878/Path of Immortality. Chapter 4798. Among the hundreds of beast race god kings, there were more than 200 who reacted quickly. When they heard the illusionary overlord's roar, they charged toward the god-slaying battleship without any regard for their own safety. Some used their ultimate skills, while others used their powerful bodies to form a line of defense to block the god-slaying battleship. Bam, 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 boom, boom. First, a sky full of divine arts slammed into the god-slaying battleship, causing the divine light barrier to shake violently. Then, the god-slaying battleship crashed into the hundreds of beast race god kings, creating a series of loud booms. Many beast race god kings were sent flying. Their massive bodies were mangled, and their limbs were severed. Blood and flesh flew everywhere in the sky. Many beast race members let out heart-wrenching cries. Aside from the hundreds of beast race members who were injured, more than 30 beast race god kings were smashed to pieces on the spot, dying on the spot. Unfortunately, no matter how strong the god-slaying battleship was, it was unable to break through the barrier formed by the beast race god kings. After the massive impact was neutralized, the god-slaying battleship stopped in the sky for a few seconds. Taking advantage of this opportunity, the hundreds of beast race god kings swarmed forward and formed a circle, surrounding the god-slaying battleship. They used all kinds of divine arts and spells to attack the god-slaying battleship like a storm. The White Dragon could only control the array formation to reform the divine light barrier and activate the divine cannons to launch a counterattack. Fortunately, there were not too many of them. Although the god-slaying battleship was under pressure, it was not defeated. The White Dragon was also able to deal with them calmly. On the other side, the battle between Ji Tianxing and the illusionary overlord became more and more intense. The illusionary overlord was constantly injured, and his injuries worsened. He was forced to retreat again and again, and could only fight as he fled. The battlefield was split into two. On one side, hundreds of beast race members surrounded the god-slaying battleship. On the other side, Ji Tianxing and the illusionary overlord were fighting fiercely. If this was the end of the battle, Ji Tianxing's side would definitely be victorious. Once he defeated or killed the illusionary overlord, it would be easy for him to rescue the god-slaying battleship. However, Jadefall Overlord quickly arrived, followed by a few dozen beast race god kings. Jadefall Overlord's goal was clear after joining the battle. She went straight for Ji Tianxing, joining forces with Void Fiend Overlord to attack Ji Tianxing. The dozens of beast race god kings behind it charged towards the god-slaying battleship. They quickly joined the encirclement and began to attack. The tide of the battle quickly turned. The god-slaying battleship continued to defend with all its might, blocking the attacks of the many beasts and looking for opportunities to counterattack. Ji Tianxing was besieged by Azure Sky Overlord and Ethereal Overlord. His momentum was restrained, and he could only fight steadily. The pressure on the illusory Overlord was greatly reduced. He finally had a chance to suppress his injuries and no longer had to retreat. The battle continued for another 10 breaths of time. Ji Tianxing had used his ultimate skills several times, but he still failed to injure Bai Luo and the illusory Overlord. If this situation continued, the battle would fall into a stalemate, and it would be difficult to determine the victor in a short period of time. This was the situation that Ji Tianxing was most unwilling to see. The longer this battle dragged on, the greater the chance that the Pantheon of Immortality and Taiyu Shrine would have of catching up. There had to be a breakthrough point or an opportunity to turn the tide of the battle. Thus, the god-slaying battleship that was besieged by several hundred beast race god kings lit up with divine light. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. 3 divine lights flashed, and 3 beautiful figures charged out of the battleship. They were 3 peerlessly beautiful women, and all of them had God Emperor stage power. They were none other than Yun Yao, Jiku, and the Prajna God Emperor. After the 3 of them charged out of the battleship, Yun Yao and Jiku waved their divine weapons and began to attack the surrounding beast race god kings. The Prajna God Emperor charged out of the encirclement and charged toward Jadefall Overlord and Ethereal Overlord. The appearance of the 3 god emperors changed the tide of the battle. The several hundred beast race god kings also let out cries of surprise. Yun Yao and Jiku unleashed their full power and unleashed all kinds of divine abilities. Sword lights and divine flames filled the sky as they rained down on the beast race god kings. Instantly, the beast race god kings became bloodied and blood-curdling screams filled the air. Dozens of beast race god kings were sliced into pieces by the sword lights before being burned to ashes by the divine flames. Their divine bodies were shattered, and their godheads were also destroyed as they scattered across the ruined battlefield. The several hundred beast race god kings were all stunned. Horror appeared on their faces as they instinctively retreated. The pressure on the god-slaying battleship was greatly reduced, and the White Dragon took advantage of this opportunity to activate its divine cannons and blast out more than 300 divine light beams. Boom, boom, boom. The divine light beams blasted into the beast race god kings, creating a series of loud booms as their flesh and blood splattered everywhere. Yun Yao and Ji Ke's faces were as cold as ice, and their killing intent soared to the sky. They kept swinging their swords and divine spears to reap the lives of the beast race god kings. Under their attacks, no one was a match for them. Every time the sword lights and spears were unleashed, there would be a large number of casualties. The beast race god kings were unable to resist at all. On the other side, the Prajna god emperor rushed into the sky and joined hands with Ji Tianxing to fight against the two beast race overlords. The Prajna god emperor had only condensed 4 Daoist rhymes and was far weaker than the two beast race overlords. However, if she could join the battle, she could at least hold the two beast race overlords back for a while. This would greatly reduce the pressure on Ji Tianxing and give him more opportunities to counterattack. In order to end the battle quickly, Ji Tianxing took advantage of this opportunity and decisively used his Sword of Annihilation. He held the Sword of Burial of Heaven with both hands and drew upon the boundless power of the world to form a giant sword that was over 10,000 feet long. He then slashed it toward the ethereal overlord. As soon as the giant golden sword appeared, it was like a blazing sun hanging in the sky, illuminating tens of thousands of miles of heaven and earth with golden light. The sword light locked onto the ethereal overlord's aura, making it impossible for him to dodge, block, or dispel. He was already heavily injured, and now that Ji Tianxing had used him as an opening, he was naturally filled with grief and despair. Jadefall, hurry and help me block it together. He knew that he couldn't dodge that sword, so he roared loudly, hoping that Jadefall could help him share the burden and block the attack together. Jadefall's instinctive reaction was to stay away from the giant golden sword and not let himself be in danger. However, he was very wise and knew that he and the ethereal overlord were in a situation where one of them would prosper and the other would suffer. If he didn't help the ethereal overlord and allowed Kenshin to kill him, he would have to fight alone and would soon be killed by Kenshin. Therefore, Jadefall decisively chose to help the ethereal overlord neutralize the Sword of Annihilation. Seeing that Jadefall was charging toward him and was about to use a divine art to block the Sword of Annihilation, the ethereal overlord heaved a sigh of relief. He thought that as long as Jadefall worked together with him, even if they couldn't completely neutralize the sword, he would at least be able to save his life. However, Pan-Rua Divine Emperor had been waiting for this moment. She unleashed all of her abilities to stop Lord Jadefall. Chapter 4799. Although the Prajna God Emperor's attack couldn't threaten the Duke of Jadefall's life, the Duke of Jadefall had to defend himself. However, the Empress of Jadefall had to block and neutralize the attack, which delayed him for a brief moment. It was this split second that prevented the Duke of Jadefall from assisting the illusory Duke and changed the outcome of the battle. Kaboom! The World Destroyer sword carried the power to destroy everything and struck the illusory ruler, engulfing its figure. Although he'd sacrificed his lifespan to form a giant crimson barrier, the Armageddon sword's power was too overwhelming. However, the power of the Armageddon sword was simply too terrifying. It easily shattered the blood-red barrier and then struck the Armageddon sword. The illusory Duke of Jadefall had cultivated for over 90,000 years. His divine body had been tempered countless times and was extremely tough. However, all of this was futile before the Armageddon sword's power. Accompanied by a loud rumbling sound, its enormous body was chopped into 2 halves on the spot. Blood and pieces of flesh splattered all over the sky. Not only did his body shatter, but even his godhead was destroyed on the spot. It exploded into a dozen fragments and scattered across the sky. The deafening explosion continued to reverberate between heaven and earth. The destructive shockwaves, wrapped in countless fragments of divine light, spread out in all directions, like ripples after ripples. The illusory Duke of Jadefall died on the spot. Fragments of his body and godhead were still floating in the air. This scene stunned the Duke of Jadefall and the several hundred god kings of the beast race. They were all petrified and dumbfounded. They couldn't believe that the most powerful illusory Duke of Jadefall had been killed by Kenshin just like that. There had been no warning at all. That earth-shattering strike had killed the illusory Duke of Jadefall. This was simply too inconceivable. The Duke of Jadefall and the several hundred god kings of the beast race were all aghast. After witnessing Ji Tianxing's terrifying power, their battle intent quickly dissipated. They wanted to retreat. In fact, the illusory Duke of Jadefall's death wasn't without warning. It wasn't like Ji Tianxing had killed him in a single strike. After all, the illusory overlord had condensed 6 Daoist rhymes and had a strong foundation. Previously, when Ji Tianxing fought it alone, it was already riddled with wounds and its divine power was weakened. Just now, it was already heavily injured, and its combat strength had dropped by nearly 50%. Thus, when the apocalyptic sword slashed down, it was within reason that he was instantly killed. While Jadefall and the several hundred god kings were still in a daze, Ji Tianxing waved his hand and put away Jadefall's quintessence fragment. Then he charged towards the god-slaying battleship with the Prajna god emperor in tow. He swung his sword and unleashed sword lights that filled the sky as he charged towards the few hundred beast race god kings. Those beast race godly kings couldn't even defeat Yun Yao and Jiku. More than 100 of them had already been killed. When they saw Ji Tianxing kill the illusory overlord with a single strike, they were stunned and scared out of their wits. At this moment, Ji Tianxing and Prajna God Emperor were charging towards them. How could they dare to resist? Naturally, they scattered and fled in all directions like their lives depended on it. Ji Tianxing's original intention wasn't to kill the beast race godly kings, but to drive them away. Since the several hundred beast race godly kings had fled, he, the Prajna God Emperor, Yun Yao, and Ji Ku escorted the god-slaying battleship to the north. Yun Yao and Ji Ku were the first to enter the battleship. The white dragon pushed the battleship's speed to the limit and rushed towards the north, leaving the battlefield behind. Ji Tianxing and the Prajna God Emperor brought up the rear, vigilantly monitoring Jadefall's every move. In the blink of an eye, the god-slaying battleship had traveled 40,000 miles and gradually disappeared into the distance. Jadefall had long regained its senses. Staring at the god-slaying battleship in Ji Tianxing, its heart was in turmoil. Originally, its first reaction was to chase after Kenshin and try to kill him no matter what. However, the godly kings of the beast race had already been killed. The several hundred beast race godly kings were its subjects and had fled in all directions. The remaining 30 or so beast race godly kings were the true subordinates of Jadefall. It was well aware that it and the 30 or so godly kings under its command were no match for Kenshin. Forget about capturing Kenshin. Once the two sides started fighting, it would be killed in less than 100 breaths of time by Kenshin. Jadefall's first thought was to defend or flee with the remaining 30 or so godly kings. As long as Kenshin and the Prajna God Emperor charged over, it would definitely turn tail and flee without hesitation. However, it didn't expect Kenshin to have no intention of pursuing after killing the godly kings. Instead, he escorted the battleship to the north. Jadefall heaved a sigh of relief. At the very least, it was out of danger for the time being. However, it was unwilling to just watch Kenshin disappear into the distance. It had sacrificed so much blood, sweat, and tears. It was so close to capturing Kenshin, but in the end, this was the result. How could it swallow this anger? But what could it do even if it was unwilling? Chase after him and throw away its life? Jadefall's heart was in turmoil. After a moment of hesitation, it still chose to follow. It would be too humiliating to turn tail and flee. It was better to keep a distance from Kenshin and observe the situation. With that in mind, Jade Fall led the 30 beast race godly kings north, maintaining a distance of 50,000 kilometers from Kenshin. Ji Tianxing and the Prajna God Emperor escorted the god-slaying battleship. After flying 80,000 kilometers north, the two entered the ship. The White Dragon drove the god-slaying battleship forward while Ji Tianxing and Prajna prepared to return to the distorted space-time to cultivate. The Prajna God Emperor was a bit worried. That guy is still following us and maintaining a distance of 50,000 kilometers. What do we do? If we ignore it and return to the distorted space-time, will anything happen? Ji Tianxing waved his hand and said, "Don't worry, nothing will happen. There were 5 beast overlords in this unknown land, and I've already killed 4 of them. There was only 1 Azure Sky Overlord left, and he had more than 30 beast race god kings under his command. What could they do? I just didn't want to waste time. Otherwise, I would have killed it long ago. It's just that it's not willing to give up, and it definitely won't dare to attack us again. According to my estimation, it will follow us for a while longer. After it calms down, it will leave." In fact, Ji Tianxing's guess was completely correct. The Empress of Jade Fall gradually calmed down and made up her mind. She would follow Yang Qi for a bit longer before leaving. However, the world was always unpredictable. Both parties flew for another 200,000 miles. Then, a stream of light appeared in the sky behind them. It was as fast as lightning. Neither the Godslayer battleship nor the Monarch of Jade Fall were slow. However, that streak of light was even faster, and the distance between it and them was gradually closing. It was impossible to see what was in the meteor-like divine light, but the aura of the God Emperor was very obvious. Chapter 4800. The Lord of Jade Fall was startled by the appearance of the divine light. Sensing the aura of the God Emperor, it couldn't help but wonder who it could be. Of the 5 lords of the unknown lands, 4 had already been killed by Kenshin. It was the only one left alive. The God Emperor that was rushing over was definitely not a lord. It had to be a foreign race. Thinking of this, the Lord of Jade Fall guessed that it was most likely someone from the 2 temples. Therefore, its mind became active, and it began to think about how to turn this sudden incident into an opportunity that was beneficial to it. It looked at the Godslayer warship in front of it, then at the divine light that was speeding up behind it. A sinister smile flashed through its eyes. Although its 4 companions had been killed one after another, it had no more helpers. However, Kenshin's enemies weren't just them. There were also the 2 temples. This was an opportunity to take advantage of. The Lord of Jade Fall maintained its flying speed and continued to chase after the Godslayer warship. At the same time, it released its divine sense to communicate with the divine light behind it. Within that dazzling divine light was a tall and sturdy figure. It was an old man with a head full of white hair. It was the founder of the pantheon of immortality, the Immortal God Emperor. In order to speed up and catch up to Kenshin, it had already put away its warship and hurried over personally. Just now, when it was running wildly in the sky, it saw a dazzling divine light shining in the sky hundreds of thousands of kilometers away. When it got close to that area, it sensed the aura of the God Emperor and faintly heard some sounds. Thus, it confirmed that the God Emperor was fighting in front of it and sped up to give chase. When it arrived at its destination, it saw that it was indeed a stretch of ruins. The ground was filled with scorched earth. There was still a violent divine aura lingering in the air. There were still fragments of divine light that hadn't scattered. The Immortal God Emperor was overjoyed. After confirming that the other party wasn't far away, it sped up again. Not long after, it saw an ancient giant beast in the sky ahead. It was hurrying along with more than 30 divine beasts. It recognized that ancient giant beast as one of the lords of the unknown lands. As for the Orc Overlord's target, it was a divine warship that was flying through the sky hundreds of thousands of kilometers away. The Immortal God Emperor scanned the area with his divine sense and recognized that it was Kenshin's ship. His emotions grew more and more excited, but at the same time, a trace of worry appeared in his heart. Just now, the Kenshin and the Beast Lord had a fierce battle. I wonder what the outcome was. What are the casualties on both sides? That Orc Overlord was only a mid-level God Emperor. He was acting alone with only 30 guards, yet he dared to pursue Kenshin. Doesn't this mean that although Kenshin managed to escape, he has long been seriously injured and his combat strength has been greatly reduced? Based on this small detail, the immortal God Emperor felt that he had deduced the truth. His heart was filled with joy and anticipation, and he couldn't help but think, if Kenshin is really heavily injured and his combat strength is very weak, then it's the best time for me to capture him. However, that orc overlord also wants to deal with Kenshin, which is a bit troublesome. It won't let Kenshin go, and it won't sit idly by as I capture Kenshin. Just as the immortal God Emperor was pondering these questions, he suddenly sensed that the orc overlord in front of him was releasing its divine sense, expressing its desire to communicate with him. This stunned the immortal God Emperor. He couldn't figure out what the other party was up to, nor could he guess its intentions. Out of instinct, he naturally refused to communicate with the orc overlord. However, the current situation was complicated and urgent. The immortal God Emperor hesitated for a moment before deciding to accept. Thus, the orc overlord's soul transmission quickly sounded in his mind. May I ask which temple master you are? Are you here to pursue Kenshin? The other party was straightforward and didn't beat around the bush, clearly expressing its sincerity. The immortal God Emperor frowned, then replied, I am from the pantheon of immortality. Or you, did you fight Kenshin just now? How are Kenshin's injuries now? The immortal God Emperor didn't beat around the bush and directly asked the question he was most concerned about. The orc overlord was a bit angry, inwardly cursing this pantheon of immortality's shamelessness. The two sides should be on equal footing, discussing cooperation and working together to deal with Kenshin. Yet, this guy immediately asked about Kenshin's injuries. From the looks of it, he wanted to leave him behind and deal with Kenshin alone. Thinking of this, the orc overlord had a plan. He transmitted again, Temple Master of the Pantheon of Immortality, since we're both here for Kenshin, we have a common goal. Why don't we work together to deal with Kenshin? What do you think? The immortal God Emperor frowned, not wanting to answer for the time being. He silently sped up in pursuit. Of course, the orc overlord wasn't willing to give up. He continued, I'm sure you know Kenshin's strength and methods. None of us can defeat him alone. Only if we work together can we have a chance at victory and capture him. In addition, this is my territory. With a single order, I can gather thousands, even thousands, of my subjects. We have absolute confidence in dealing with Kenshin in this area. The immortal God Emperor raised an eyebrow and glanced at him, silently weighing the pros and cons. Admittedly, the orc overlord's words made sense. The immortal God Emperor was naturally aware of Kenshin's strength and methods. Otherwise, Kenshin wouldn't have caused so much trouble in the two temples, provoking so many God Emperor powerhouses to chase after him. However, what the immortal God Emperor was thinking was that he still had several temple lords under him who would be able to meet up with him soon. As long as he could pin down Kenshin, even if he couldn't capture him for the time being, he could at least delay him for a while. Once his temple lords arrived, capturing Kenshin would be as easy as turning over his hand. In truth, he could choose to work with the orc overlord, or he could choose not to. In any case, Kenshin was only a few 100,000 kilometers away. He could catch up very quickly. However, the immortal God Emperor didn't want to complicate matters. He couldn't help but worry that if he refused the orc overlord's offer, the orc overlord might try to trip him up and ruin his plans. With that in mind, the immortal God Emperor transmitted to the orc overlord, All right, this seat can work with you. Tell me your identity and your thoughts. The orc overlord had already thought of a plan. This emperor is the orc overlord of Jade Fall. We can work together to capture Kenshin. After capturing Kenshin, we can share the information and the secret of immortality. In any case, at this point, everyone was well aware that Kenshin was the chosen one. If he could solve the mystery of immortality, there was no need to hide it. The immortal God Emperor sneered inwardly. He had already planned out the orc overlord's ending, so he agreed without hesitation. Chapter 4801. To the strong, honesty was something they could do without. Whether or not they kept their promises depended on the other party's strength. The immortal God Emperor had already thought it through. He would temporarily agree to Lord Bailuo's request and pretend to cooperate to gain his trust. After they successfully captured Kenshin, they would kick Lord Bailuo away. Lord Bailuo acted alone and was weak. No matter how angry he was, he wouldn't dare to go against the pantheon of immortality. If Lord Bailuo was really that foolish, then the pantheon of immortality would have destroyed him. After all, most of the lords in this unknown land were dead or injured. When the time came, the pantheon of immortality would obtain the mystery of immortality and gather an army to conquer this unknown land. In short, the immortal God Emperor didn't care about Lord Bailuo, nor did he recognize him as his partner. Lord Bailuo's intelligence and shrewdness were far inferior to the immortal God Emperor's. But he wasn't a fool. How could he easily believe the immortal God Emperor's words? Seeing that the immortal God Emperor had agreed so readily, it took the opportunity to add, "Sir, words are no guarantee. Swear an oath to the heavens first, then we can form an alliance." The beast races that lived in various unknown lands didn't have much knowledge about refining weapons or setting up arrays. In the eyes of the desolate race, they were uncivilized beasts and worshipped the heavens. Once they encountered a major event or formed an alliance, they believed in swearing to the heavens. What? The immortal God Emperor's expression changed on the spot. His eyes flashed coldly as he said in a deep voice, "I am the founder of the pantheon of immortality. I have always kept my word. Why would I lie to you? What's the use of swearing to the heavens? You are too naive." Clearly, the immortal God Emperor didn't like swearing to the heavens. It wasn't because he thought the oath was naive, but because he was afraid that he would be punished by the heavens if he went against the oath. Seeing the clues, Jade Fall sneered. "First Hallmaster of the pantheon of immortality? Then you should be even more aware that we beast clans trust oaths from the heavens the most. Since you're so resistant, I'm sure you don't have much sincerity. If that's the case, then there's no point in talking about our alliance and cooperation." The undying God Emperor sneered. "So what if we don't cooperate? Just based on your strength, it's not enough to be mentioned in the same breath as me. Let me advise you to leave this place as soon as possible and not get involved in this matter. Otherwise, I can't guarantee that I won't attack you. You know the consequences." The Azure Sky Overlord was well aware of the pantheon of immortality's power, but how could it not retaliate after being humiliated like this? Previously, I did intend to leave and not ask about this matter. However, after hearing what First Palace Master said, this Emperor's interest is piqued. I want to see how the pantheon of immortality will defeat and capture the Kenshin. The negotiations between the two sides fell apart. It would be difficult to reach an agreement again. The Azure Sky Overlord was so straightforward because it was full of shame and anger. Secondly, the other party was the First Palace Master of the pantheon of immortality. 4 of the 5 lords of the unknown lands had been killed. It was the only one left. If it didn't find a way to weaken the pantheon of immortality's strength, the pantheon of immortality would only grow stronger in the future. It would only be a matter of time before it invaded the unknown lands. Therefore, it had to create obstacles and disturb the pantheon of immortality so it couldn't do as it wished. It would be best if it could kill a few pantheon of immortality. That way, the unknown lands would have at least a few thousand years of peace. The undying God Emperor ignored the Azure Sky Overlord and sped up, his consciousness locked onto the God-Slayer worship. In a short 15 minutes, he overtook the Azure Sky Overlord and gradually closed the distance between him and the God-Slayer worship. Although the immortal God Emperor was confident that Jade Fall wouldn't dare attack him at such a close distance, he was confident that Jade Fall wouldn't attack. However, he still maintained his vigilance as he overtook the Azure Sky Overlord. He was also worried that the Azure Sky Overlord would fly into a rage out of humiliation and suddenly attack him. Even if it couldn't cause him too much damage, it would at least delay him for a while. Fortunately, the Azure Sky Overlord was relatively calm. When the undying God Emperor overtook it and left it more than 10,000 li behind, it still didn't seem to have any intention of attacking. The undying God Emperor sneered inwardly. At least this beast was tactful and didn't ask for trouble. However, as soon as this thought flashed through his mind, he was slapped in the face. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. Without any warning, the Azure Sky Overlord suddenly released several dozen blades of divine light. Like a rain of arrows, they bombarded the undying God Emperor. The undying God Emperor had just let down his guard and was feeling smug when he was suddenly attacked. His expression immediately changed. "Bastard, you're courting death." The undying God Emperor roared in anger. He could only summon a war blade and brandish it to block the Azure Sky Overlord's attack. Although he had the strength of an upper God Emperor, he didn't dare to ignore the Azure Sky Overlord's sneak attack. He could only use 100% of his strength to neutralize it. Bang 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 bang. Several dozen dazzling five-colored blade lights collided with the divine light blades. A series of loud explosions erupted in the sky, spreading for tens of thousands of li. The violent shockwaves blew up a hurricane between heaven and earth, destroying a dozen mountains. There was no suspense in the outcome. The Azure Sky Overlord's sneak attack was easily neutralized by the undying God Emperor. However, the Azure Sky Overlord's goal was achieved. The undying God Emperor was delayed for 2 breaths of time. The distance between him and the Godslayer warship increased by another 10,000 li. It took the Immortal God Emperor half an hour to close the gap between the two of them. In the end, the Azure Sky Overlord's casual attack made all his efforts go to waste. This enraged the undying God Emperor. He wanted nothing more than to tear the Azure Sky Overlord into 1,000 pieces to vent his anger. He glared at the Azure Sky Overlord, his entire body surging with killing intent. There were several times when he couldn't resist the urge to attack. However, the Azure Sky Overlord wasn't afraid at all. He even sneered contemptuously at the undying God Emperor and transmitted a provocative message. "Undying God Emperor, you must be very irritable and want to kill this Emperor, right? Haha, unfortunately for you, you've spent so much effort and sacrificed so much to catch up to Kenshin. How can I give you up? As long as you dare to attack me, I will definitely stall for time with you. At that time, Kenshin will escape without a trace. None of us will be able to catch up to him." Both Jadefall Lord and the Immortal God Emperor were well aware of this and were wary of it as well. The Azure Sky Overlord knew that his opponent was an Upper God Emperor and that he couldn't defeat him. If the Undying God Emperor wanted to kill him, he would do everything in his power to escape. He wouldn't hesitate to stay. The Undying God Emperor also understood that although he was stronger, it would take him at least an incense stick's worth of time to kill him. By then, Kenshin would be millions of li away. He wouldn't be able to catch up even if he wanted to. /book_15878/Immortal Pilgrimage Path. Chapter 4802. The Immortal God Emperor was enraged, but he couldn't afford to waste time on Jadefall, so he simply ignored her. He only cared about speeding up and shaking off Jadefall as soon as possible. Tens of thousands of miles ahead, the Godslayer warship was also speeding forward at full speed. In the cockpit, White Dragon was focused on controlling the warship, trying to find a way to accelerate. Given his strength and methods, he couldn't detect the Immortal God Emperor's pursuit for more than 100,000 kilometers behind him. Fortunately, after Ji Tianxing and Hanya God Emperor returned to the warship, they didn't immediately enter the distorted spacetime and stayed in the cockpit for a while. It was because Ji Tianxing had used his divine sense to detect the God Emperor's aura rapidly approaching that he became vigilant. As for Hanya God Emperor, Ji Tianxing had already sent her back to the distorted spacetime to cultivate. The reason was simple. Ji Tianxing predicted that in the next few days, the two sides would be constantly chasing each other. It was unlikely that they would fight to the death. This matter was left to him to think of a way to shake off the Immortal God Emperor. Hanya God Emperor needed to conserve her strength in order to deal with the upcoming battle. After Hanya God Emperor entered the distorted spacetime, Ji Tianxing remained in the cockpit, silently observing the Immortal God Emperor's movements. As time passed, he discovered that the Immortal God Emperor was getting closer and closer. Reality had long since proven that the immortal God Emperor's speed far exceeded that of the God-Slayer worship. If Ji Tianxing didn't make any changes, the immortal God Emperor would catch up to the God-Slayer worship in at most an hour. Thus, he decisively made a choice. Putting away the God-Slayer worship, he would be in charge of the journey and find a way to shake off the immortal God Emperor. In a flash of white light, Ji Tianxing put away the God-Slayer worship and appeared in the sky. In any case, the immortal God Emperor had already discovered the God-Slayer worship and tacitly agreed that he was here. There was no need for him to continue hiding. His speed far exceeded the God-Slayer worships, and he had a better chance of shaking off the immortal God Emperor. Shua! When he appeared in the sky, white divine light gushed out of his body and disappeared in a flash. In the next instant he also disappeared from the sky. This was the ultimate skill of so close, yet worlds apart, which allowed him to instantly traverse a distance of 150,000 miles and disappear into the horizon. The distance between him and the undying God Emperor was now nearly 300,000 kilometers. Unfortunately, it was still within 400,000 li, unable to escape the range of the undying God Emperor's divine sense. The immortal God Emperor immediately noticed this and frowned. His eyes flashed with a cold light. Damn bastard, it's the same trick again. In the past few months of pursuit, he had already experienced Ji Tianxing's strength and methods. He had also witnessed the might of so close, yet worlds apart many times. It was an experience that made him very angry and he didn't want to think about. When he thought about the fact that he would have to travel a long distance with the Kenshin again and again, the distance between the two sides would be shortened and widened, and they would not be able to fight head-on for the next few days, he felt powerless. But now that things had come to this, what else could he do? Behind the undying God Emperor, the ruler of Jadefall was now 30,000 li away. His divine sense had also detected that Kenshin had disappeared in a flash and then reappeared 300,000 li away. His opponent's use of spatial teleportation surprised him, and at the same time, he began to ponder his next plan. He decided not to launch any more sneak attacks or harass the undying God Emperor, so as to prevent Kenshin from widening the distance and truly escaping. On the contrary, he hoped that the undying God Emperor would catch up to Kenshin as soon as possible. Only then would he have an opportunity to take advantage of the situation. Just as the undying God Emperor predicted, the two sides spent the next 2 days in pursuit. Ji Tianxing was always in front of the undying God Emperor, the distance between the two constantly fluctuating between 100,000 and 300,000 li. Every time the undying God Emperor was about to catch up to Ji Tianxing, he would use his ultimate skill, so close, yet worlds apart, to widen the distance. However, this ultimate skill had a limit, and it couldn't be used continuously. At the very least, it needed a quarter of an hour between each use. Thus, Ji Tianxing was still unable to shake off the undying God Emperor. As long as the distance between the two sides didn't exceed 400,000 li, he wouldn't be able to change his path even if he wanted to. As for the ruler of Jadefall, it was a bit miserable. Indeed, it didn't launch any more sneak attacks on the undying God Emperor, mainly because it was being left further and further behind, and gradually couldn't keep up. Even if it used all its strength and all kinds of abilities, it still couldn't catch up to the undying God Emperor, let alone Kenshin. 2 days later, it had long since been left behind millions of li behind, completely out of sight. If it was before, it would definitely have given up on the chase and turned around to return to its nest. However, things were different now. It was in a huff with the undying God Emperor, and was determined to ruin the God Emperor's plans. Most importantly, Kenshin, who possessed the secret of eternal life, wasn't far away. The general trend was already set, and Kenshin was destined to never escape the continent of origin. How could it not take a gamble? If it missed this opportunity and allowed the two temple masters to obtain it in the future, it would never be able to forgive itself. Thus, the three powerhouses chased after each other, expending vast amounts of divine power. They were panting from exhaustion, but they couldn't stop. What they couldn't see was that even further behind them, millions of li away, there was another streak of divine light hurtling through the air. Within that streak of divine light was the figure of a powerhouse, exuding the aura of a god emperor. It was none other than Taiyu God Emperor, who had been chasing after them all this time. On the morning of the third day, Ji Tianxing left the unknown lands. When he crossed the last of the majestic mountain ranges, he was greeted by a vast expanse of flat land. This grayish-black flat land extended for tens of thousands of li before connecting to a dark yellow beach. At the end of the horizon was the azure sea, stretching as far as the eye could see. Clearly, after passing through this unknown land, one would enter the boundless chaos sea. This was Ji Tianxing's destination. As long as he could enter the depths of the chaos sea, he was confident that he could deal with the two temple masters. Seeing that he was about to enter the chaos sea, he inwardly breathed a sigh of relief and became much more confident. However, something unexpected happened. On the grayish-black ground, there seemed to be only a few short shrubs on the surface, but thorns and vines were everywhere. However, the ground suddenly lit up with divine light that soared into the sky, and thousands of densely packed figures emerged. Bush, 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 bush. They were vicious divine beasts. Some drilled through the ground, some ran on the ground, and some flew in the sky. There were several dozen species in total. However, all of them were brimming with murderous aura. They came menacingly and let out excited roars as they charged towards Ji Tianxing. Seeing this scene, Ji Tianxing frowned on the spot. His eyes flashed with anger and coldness. Damn it! Did the Lord of Jade Heaven ally with the immortal God Emperor? His first reaction was that the Lord of Jade Heaven had allied with the immortal God Emperor. Otherwise, the Lord of Jade Heaven wouldn't have ordered several thousand God King beasts to lie in ambush on the Chaos Sea. Chapter 4803. If it weren't for the undying God Emperor chasing after him, Ji Tianxing wouldn't have cared about the 3,000 or so beast race God Kings at all. As long as he was willing, he could kill all of those God Kings within 2 hours. But the problem now was that the Lord of Jadefall had arranged for 3,000 beast race God Kings to ambush him at the Chaos Seaside. The beast race God Kings didn't need to catch him. They only needed to delay him for a short while. Once the undying God Emperor arrived, he would naturally hold him back and the beast race God Kings could retreat. It was for this reason that Ji Tianxing suspected that the Lord of Jadefall had formed an alliance with the undying God Emperor. Now that things had developed to this point, it was beyond Ji Tianxing's control. Even if he changed his route at the last minute, it would be useless. The two sides were too close. Moreover, after crossing the last mountain range, what lay ahead was an endless stretch of plains and beaches, as well as the azure sea. There were no obstructions that could help him conceal his aura. Even with the 3,000 beast race God Kings charging at him, he could only grit his teeth and meet them head-on. Kill. Charge. Stop him, we have to stop him no matter what. The Lord has ordered that as long as we can stop Kenshin, we will all be handsomely rewarded. The 3,000 beast race God Kings roared and shouted as they charged at Ji Tianxing. They unleashed their full strength and used all sorts of abilities to surround Ji Tianxing. Thousands of divine arts converged in the sky and rained down on Ji Tianxing like a torrential flood. He was fearless as golden light surged from his body, forming a barrier of divine light around him. At the same time, he punched out with his left hand and swung the sword of burial of heaven with his right hand, sending out sword light that filled the sky. In the next instant, the dazzling golden fist slammed into the beast horde with an earth-shattering boom. Then, the sword light that filled the sky shattered countless divine arts and landed on the beast horde. Another series of muffled bang 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 sounds rang out. Countless broken limbs and blood splattered all over the place. Shrill screams tore through the sky, reverberating endlessly in everyone's ears. In just a single exchange, Ji Tianxing had heavily injured over 100 beast race God Kings and killed over 100 of them on the spot. The attacks of the beast race God Kings all landed on him, but they were all blocked by his barrier of divine light and did not cause him any harm. Boom! Following a muffled explosion, Ji Tianxing charged into the group of beasts like a primordial beast, carrying a golden flame that soared into the sky. It couldn't be helped. The defensive line formed by more than 3,000 beast race god kings was too long. He couldn't waste time going around it. The best way was to forcefully break through the defensive line formed by the beast race god kings and escape from this area as quickly as possible. Ji Tianxing's imposing manner was overwhelming. His ferocious charge instantly tore the godly kings of the beast race into pieces as they cried out in agony. The several dozen beast race god kings in front of him were instantly pulverized. Countless pieces of flesh and blood splattered everywhere. The beast race god kings closer to him all scattered in fright, retreating to the sides. The defensive line in front of Ji Tianxing had become very thin. He would be able to break out of the encirclement very soon. At this moment, the leaders of the several thousand beast race god kings all roared angrily. They led the beast race god kings in a reckless charge toward Ji Tianxing. They were willing to sacrifice their lives to stop Ji Tianxing. Even if they couldn't stop him, they had to delay him for a while so that he couldn't escape successfully. Piss off! Ji Tianxing was enraged. He roared loudly, divine flames erupting from his body. They were as dazzling as the sun as he charged forward. The several dozen beast race god kings to his left and right were instantly charred black by the divine flames. Black smoke rose from their bodies. 80% of them were burned to death on the spot. A gust of wind reduced them to black ash. Only 20% of the beast race god kings were still alive, but they were barely hanging on to their last breaths. However, no matter how ferocious his charge was or how violent his charge was, he couldn't kill so many beast race god kings in a short period of time. There were far too many beast race god kings in front of him. There were more than 1,000 of them. Ji Tianxing was heavily surrounded. It was as if he had sunk into a quagmire. His movement speed also slowed. The Lord of Jadefall had achieved his goal. The 3,000 beast race god kings had indeed stalled him for 10 breaths of time. Just as Ji Tianxing was about to unleash his fury and slaughter the beast race god kings, the immortal god emperor arrived. Kenshin, where do you think you're going? The immortal god emperor didn't forget to roar as he charged into the fray. This roar wasn't just to boost his momentum. It was also a declaration to the beast race god kings that he and Kenshin were enemies. As the saying went, the enemy of an enemy was a friend. Since the beast race god kings were also Kenshin's enemies, there was no need to oppose him. This move was effective. The beast race god kings surrounding Ji Tianxing immediately scattered. They were planning to sacrifice their lives to buy time. They all turned to look at the immortal god emperor. While they were curious about his identity, they also harbored a trace of anticipation. Even though they didn't know him, it would be best if he could defeat or capture Kenshin. Whoosh! After the beast race god kings dispersed, the immortal god emperor locked onto Ji Tianxing's aura and slashed out with his divine saber. The 3 dazzling saber glows were over 1,000 zhang long. They were dazzling and emitted a destructive aura. The expressions of the beast race god kings changed as they hurriedly retreated. They wanted to make space for Ji Tianxing and the immortal god emperor to fight. They were well aware that a battle between 2 powerful god emperor powerhouses was not something they could participate in. Ji Tianxing's consciousness had been covering the entire area, monitoring the movements of the battlefield. The immortal god emperor's arrival and his all-out attack were all under his control. He had long since been prepared. When he saw the 3 saber lights descending from the sky, he abandoned the beast race god kings around him and focused on the immortal god emperor. Sword shatters the 9 heavens. Ji Tianxing roared. He gripped the sword of burial of heaven with both hands and thrust it with all his might, aiming for the immortal god emperor. A loud boom was heard. Ji Tianxing's golden sword instantly shattered one of the saber lights, causing it to explode into fragments. Immediately afterward, the golden sword struck the second saber light and pulverized it. At this point, the golden sword's power had been greatly reduced and its light had dimmed greatly. Then, the golden sword collided with the third saber light, causing both to explode into millions of shards of divine light. The violent impact carried countless fragments of divine light and spread out in all directions, causing ripples to appear one after another. The mountain range behind them was instantly destroyed by the shockwaves of the battle. It collapsed into rubble, kicking up a cloud of dust. Chapter 4804. Most of the beast race god kings closer to Ji Tianxing and the immortal god emperor had been knocked back by the shockwaves of their battle. Some of the unlucky fellows had been heavily injured, blood spurting from their orifices or drenched in blood. This time, no one dared to charge forward, much less approach the battlefield where the two god emperors were fighting. All of them retreated into the distance. High in the sky, Ji Tianxing and the immortal god emperor were engaged in a fierce battle. Ji Tianxing fought as he retreated, determined to escape from the immortal god emperor and enter the Sea of Chaos. And the immortal god emperor had chased Ji Tianxing for so long, finally catching up to him at the Sea of Chaos, so how could he let him go so easily? He used all sorts of divine abilities and supreme techniques to tie down Ji Tianxing, not allowing him to escape. The two of them did not dare to be careless. They used all of their strength and used their ultimate skills. But the result of their battle left the immortal god emperor stunned and incredulous. He had originally believed that with his strength as an upper-level god emperor, he would be able to easily defeat Ji Tianxing and even capture him on the spot. But after exchanging 10 blows, the immortal god emperor realized that he had been careless. While facing Ji Tianxing, he had not had much of an advantage. Besides fighting to a draw, he had only been able to slightly suppress his opponent. Of course, he believed that he had an invisible advantage. That was, he had cultivated for a longer period of time and accumulated more energy. Even if the two of them continued to fight to a draw, he would be able to last longer and exhaust Ji Tianxing's divine power first. But whether or not this was the case, there was no way to know. Rumble! Bang bang bang! Ji Tianxing and the immortal god emperor fought fiercely high in the sky, the divine abilities and supreme techniques of both sides constantly clashing, erupting with dull booms and sending countless shards of divine light flying. Wave after wave of berserk divine power rippled outwards along with the dazzling divine light. The shockwaves from the battle destroyed the land within a radius of 50,000 miles. The mountains were turned into ruins, and the flat land was turned into deep craters. Thick dust drifted between heaven and earth, blocking out the sunlight and causing the dazzling divine light to become indistinct. As for Ji Tianxing and the immortal god emperor, their figures flickered in and out of view. Even the beast race god kings watching from afar couldn't see them clearly. In order to avoid being injured by the shockwaves from the battle between the two powerhouses, the 3,000 beast race god kings all retreated 50,000 miles away. As they watched the battle between Ji Tianxing and the undying god emperor, they prayed for Jadefall to arrive as soon as possible. As for the battle between the Kenshin and the undying god emperor, they did not wish for either side to emerge victorious. The best outcome would be for both sides to suffer heavy losses. Only then would Jadefall be able to catch Kenshin with ease. Time passed quietly. Soon, 100 breaths of time had passed. Ji Tianxing and the undying god emperor had exchanged more than 200 blows. Both sides had suffered light injuries and neither had gained the upper hand. This made the undying god emperor extremely angry and ashamed. He was a genuine upper god emperor, yet he couldn't even deal with a middle god emperor. Who would believe it if word of this got out? In addition, Ji Tianxing stubbornly moved northward, fleeing over 100,000 miles. However, the undying god emperor continued to entangle him, making it impossible for him to escape. Even if he fled northward for 100,000 miles, he would only be moving the battlefield, leaving behind nothing but rubble, craters, and ravines. Ji Tianxing grew more and more anxious. His mood and expression both grew heavier and heavier. He was well aware that the longer this dragged on, the more dangerous his situation would become. Unfortunately, the undying god emperor also understood this, which was why he did not hesitate to use any means to entangle him. Soon, their predictions were verified. The thing Ji Tianxing didn't want to see the most had happened. In the southern sky, a dazzling streak of divine light was hurtling toward them. Within this streak of divine light was a mountainous figure, exuding a monstrous ferocity and the majesty of a god emperor. Seeing this streak of divine light rapidly approach, the 3,000 or so beast race god kings watching the battle all cheered in excitement. The person they had been waiting for had finally arrived. The Realm Lord of Jade Heaven charged into the battlefield with the aura of a victor and headed straight for Ji Tianxing and the Immortal God Emperor who weren't far away. Its target was naturally Ji Tianxing. Not only were the 3,000 beast race god kings cheering, but the undying God Emperor also secretly heaved a sigh of relief. He was now more confident in capturing Kenshin. Roar! The Jade Fall Monarch let loose an enraged roar as it charged toward Ji Tianxing with overwhelming killing intent. It was still close to 10,000 kilometers away from Ji Tianxing, but it had already unleashed several dozen streaks of divine light, all of which locked onto Ji Tianxing's vitals. Ji Tianxing was in the middle of a battle with the undying God Emperor. He had just used a supreme technique to nullify the undying God Emperor's powerful attack. He saw several dozen streaks of divine light hurtling toward him, but he didn't have time to defend himself. In this dire situation, he could only condense a barrier of divine light and raise his defenses to the limit. Of course, he still tried to evade as best as he could, hoping to avoid these streaks of divine light. Bam bam bam. In the next instant, half of the streaks of divine light struck him, sending him tumbling hundreds of kilometers away. The other half of the streaks of divine light were dodged by him. They tore through the sky and landed on the ground in the distance, cleaving a dozen huge trenches in the ground and kicking up a cloud of dust. Although Ji Tianxing's barrier of divine light had several cracks and was on the verge of collapse, he wasn't injured at all. However, he did not suffer any injuries. After flying 100 miles away, he quickly stabilized his body. He even used the force of the impact to accelerate northward, hoping to open up some distance and shake off the Jade Fall Monarch and the undying God Emperor. Unfortunately, the Immortal God Emperor had seen through his intentions long ago. He rushed forward in time and executed a secret technique to intercept him. Ji Tianxing had no choice but to stop running. He swung the Sword of Burial of Heaven and used a supreme technique to block the undying God Emperor's attack. Bam bam bam. The sword light and saber light of the two people collided fiercely in the sky, causing a deafening sound to burst out, causing the earth to tremble and jump. The undying God Emperor's attack was stopped, but the Jade Fall Monarch charged forward again, not giving Ji Tianxing any time to catch his breath. Ji Tianxing had no choice but to focus and face the Jade Fall Monarch once more. The undying God Emperor also joined the battle, attacking Ji Tianxing with all his might, reaching a tacit understanding with the Jade Fall Monarch. The pressure on Ji Tianxing increased sharply, and he could only deal with the Jade Fall Monarch. He was gradually pushed back southward by the undying God Emperor. Tens of thousands of kilometers away, the 3,000 God Kings of the beast race saw that the Jade Fall Monarch had gained the upper hand and roared in excitement, baring their fangs and brandishing their claws as they charged over. They formed a huge encirclement around Ji Tianxing and attacked without any regard for their own safety. This time, the pressure on Ji Tianxing was even greater. He was almost beaten to the point where he had no strength to resist. He had no choice but to summon the Prajna God Emperor, Yun Yao, and Ji Ku to assist him. Chapter 48:05. Swish. Swish. Following a few flashes of divine light, Pan Ruo, Yun Yao, and Ji Ku appeared in the sky. Surrounded by thousands of beast race god kings, the three great empresses did not panic at all. Ji Tianxing's target was the undying God Emperor. He was attacking with all his might, or at least neutralizing the undying God Emperor's attacks. The Prajna God Emperor's target was the monarch of Jade Fall. Even though she was a level lower than him, she was still able to match him with 2 Emperor-grade artifacts. Even if she was at a disadvantage for a short time, she wouldn't be defeated by the Lord of Azure Sky. Yun Yao and Ji Ku were slightly weaker. They ignored Bai Luo and the undying God Emperor and focused on killing the beast race god kings around them. With their strength, if the 3,000 god kings of the beast race worked together to attack them, they would definitely not be their match. They would be surrounded and killed very quickly. However, the beast race's godly monarch's target was Ji Tianxing. They only sent a small portion of their forces to deal with Yun Yao and Ji Ku. This gave the two of them an opportunity to charge into the encirclement. They unleashed all of their strength and used all kinds of divine abilities and ultimate techniques. Boom boom boom. Jiku brandished his divine spear and unleashed Nirvana divine flames that blotted out the sky. They rained down on the beast horde like a torrential flood, incinerating many beast race deity kings into ashes. Any beast race god kings that were tainted by the Nirvana divine flames would be severely injured even if they didn't die. Wave after wave of heart-wrenching cries and painful screams exploded in the sky, echoing endlessly between heaven and earth. Swish. Swish. Yun Yao's hands were as fast as lightning. She waved a pair of monarch-grade divine swords and constantly slashed out silvery white crescent-shaped sword lights, which fell among the beasts like a fairy scattering flowers. Sword lights crisscrossed, forming a sword net in the sky, shuttling back and forth, strangling and killing. How could those beast god kings block such a tricky, agile, and sharp sword light? Their protective divine light was shattered one after another, and their powerful defenses were penetrated. Their bodies were quickly sliced and pierced by the sword light, causing blood to splatter all over the sky. Screams of agony rang out again and again. Furious roars and roars rang out incessantly, shaking the earth and mountains within a radius of tens of thousands of miles. Both sides had only exchanged a few blows, but Yun Yao and Jiku had already killed more than 300 beast race god kings and injured more than 200. When the beast race god king commanders saw that these two women were actually so strong, they had indeed underestimated them. Hence, the commanders hurriedly ordered half of the beast race's godly kings to focus on Yun Yao and Jiku. They had to kill them as soon as possible. Meanwhile, the other half of the beast race god kings were still attacking Ji Tianxing and exerting pressure on him. Ji Tianxing was under the most pressure. He had to fend off the undying god emperor's attacks while fending off the attacks of the beast race's god kings. He was mentally and physically exhausted, and his divine power was greatly depleted. His face was also gradually turning pale. Seeing this, the undying god emperor sneered in his heart. He was quite pleased with himself. So what if you're the one chosen by the heavens? You're still too young and don't have much strength. How can you possibly stop an army of thousands? Now that you've expended too much energy, your battle prowess will quickly decline. In at most 4 hours, you'll have exhausted all of your divine power and become extremely weak. When that time comes, the palace lords under my command will arrive and capture you in one fell swoop. The undying god emperor was secretly pleased with himself. The heavenly monarch of Jade Heaven was also scheming in his heart. He was naturally able to easily deal with the wisdom god emperor without much pressure. If he wanted to defeat the wisdom god emperor and end the battle in a short time, it was basically impossible. However, he had never thought of doing that. He only wanted to stall for time and observe the situation before adapting to the situation. In reality, he also didn't want Ji Tianxing to be defeated too quickly. If Ji Tianxing was quickly defeated, he would have to make a choice. Either the undying god emperor would capture Ji Tianxing, or he would capture Ji Tianxing. However, no matter which one of them captured Ji Tianxing, they would have to fight each other and continue to kill each other. The heavenly monarch of Jade Heaven knew that he wasn't a match for the undying god emperor. If he clashed, he had no chance of victory. Thus, he wanted to stall for time and let Kenshin exhaust more of the undying god emperor's power. It wouldn't be too late to decide the victor once both of them were exhausted and weak. At that time, he would have a chance to capture Kenshin, defeat the undying god emperor, and take Kenshin away. With such thoughts in mind, the heavenly monarch of Jade Heaven began to deliberately go easy on Ji Tianxing while keeping an eye on him. Prajna god emperor vaguely felt that her opponent's strength was slipping, and the pressure on her was also weakening. Thus, she attacked even harder, wanting to suppress the heavenly monarch of Jade Heaven and create an opportunity for Ji Tianxing to escape. Ji Tianxing's perception was very sharp, and his mind was very active. His heart was burning with worry, and he was filled with anxiety, thinking about how to escape. He thought of many ideas, but none of them worked. Then he noticed the heavenly monarch of Jade Heaven's actions. What is this guy doing? He's clearly more powerful than this, so why is his strength slipping so quickly? Ji Tianxing frowned and observed the heavenly monarch of Jade Heaven for a while. Suddenly, an idea flashed through his mind. Oh, this guy is very cunning. He's deliberately stalling for time to adjust the situation. He wants me and the undying God Emperor to both be injured, then he can reap the benefits. Since that's the case, I can use him as a way to escape. As the saying goes, there's a light at the end of the tunnel. Ji Tianxing immediately thought of a way to escape. Thus, as he fought with the undying God Emperor, he became more and more anxious. His strength was also slowly declining, and the power of his attacks was also weakening. Because his performance was very realistic, the weakening of his strength was also gradual. This made the undying God Emperor and the heavenly monarch of Jade Heaven believe him, and they definitely wouldn't suspect him of acting. Seeing Ji Tianxing's face becoming paler and paler, and his strength weakening, the undying God Emperor was filled with anxiety, and once again sped up the pace of his attacks. He wanted to strike while the iron was hot and expand the results of the battle. He wanted to quickly defeat Ji Tianxing and capture him. But the heavenly monarch of Jade Heaven saw this scene and was unhappy. Damn it! Isn't that Kenshin very capable? How can he not defeat the undying God Emperor after a few hundred moves, and end up in such a sorry state? Sigh, looks like the so-called Chosen One isn't as strong as we thought. The heavenly monarch of Jade Heaven felt that Kenshin was only a mid-level God Emperor, and it was normal that he couldn't defeat the undying God Emperor. However, the undying God Emperor still hadn't used up much of his strength. He absolutely couldn't allow the undying God Emperor and Kenshin to decide a victor now. Thus, he ordered the beast race God Kings under his command to slow down the pace of their attacks. He even ordered some of the beast race God Kings to retreat with their injured and recuperate. In the blink of an eye, the 3,000 beast race God Kings were reduced to 2,000. They were all leisurely attacking Ji Tianxing, Yun Yao, and Ji Ku. Chapter 4806. With nearly 1,000 beast god kings retreating, the remaining 2,000 attacked at a leisurely pace. This greatly reduced the pressure on Ji Tianxing and the others, but increased the pressure on the undying God Emperor. In order to suppress Ji Tianxing, the undying God Emperor had no choice but to expend even more divine force and use even more powerful combat arts. Of course, he was no fool. He immediately realized the root of the problem and guessed Jadefall's thoughts. Filled with rage, he turned and glared at Jadefall. "You damned beast," he transmitted. "You want to harm me?" "Immortal God Emperor," Jadefall sneered. "You and I both know what's going on, so why bother feigning ignorance in front of me? You and I both want to capture Kenshin and solve the mystery of eternal life. I expressed my sincerity to you and offered to work with you for mutual benefit, but you refused. Since that's the case, how can I let you get what you want so easily?" The Immortal God Emperor continued to send a message to Jadefall as he fought Ji Tianxing. "You think you can work with me with just your power? What qualifications do you have? Do you think that by playing a little trick, you can make me back down? If you know what's good for you, you'll obediently cooperate and capture Kenshin as soon as possible. When the time comes, I can even give you some benefits out of consideration for your contributions. But if you continue to be stubborn, don't blame me for being merciless and not letting you off." The undying God Emperor was certain that Jadefall wouldn't give up after paying such a heavy price to chase him all the way here. Simply put, Jadefall didn't dare retreat and create an opportunity for Kenshin to escape. He still held hope for the secret of eternal life and wanted to capture Kenshin. Only with this in mind could the undying God Emperor act without fear. But reality proved that the undying God Emperor had miscalculated. Jadefall had indeed thought so from the start. It was just as he'd expected. Jadefall Overlord wasn't willing to give up. He still had hope for the mystery of eternal life. But now, things were different. The Immortal God Emperor's attitude was tyrannical and unreasonable. It was clear that he wanted to swallow the fruits of his labor alone, not sharing or cooperating with anyone else. The Azure Sky Overlord knew that it didn't have the qualifications to fight against the pantheon of immortality, much less snatch food from the tiger's mouth. Now was its only chance to threaten the Immortal Emperor. If it failed to threaten the Immortal Emperor, What awaited it would be the revenge of the pantheon of immortality. Since the undying God Emperor didn't give it a chance, there was no need for it to give the God Emperor a chance. Thus, Jadefall Overlord decisively ordered all God Kings to withdraw from the battlefield and wait for further orders 50,000 miles away from the battlefield. Even it gradually stopped casting spells to attack and gradually retreated from the battlefield, staying 20,000 miles away in the sky to watch the battle. Now, the immortal God Emperor was in a very awkward situation. He was fighting alone, surrounded by Ji Tianxing, Pan Ri, Yun Yao, and Ji Ku. Even though he had the strength of an upper God Emperor, he could only fight to a draw with Ji Tianxing. Being surrounded by 4 God Emperors, he was naturally at a disadvantage. Not only did he have to expend more divine power, his battle prowess began to decline and his injuries worsened. The immortal God Emperor resisted the attacks of Ji Tianxing and the others while cursing Jadefall Overlord's shamelessness. He swore to tear Jadefall to pieces and raze his territory to the ground. At the same time, the immortal God Emperor was silently praying that his subordinates could come to his aid as soon as possible. After the two sides exchanged close to 100 moves, Ji Tianxing had Yun Yao and Ji Ku return to the distorted space-time of Jiutian 10 Extremes Tower. The two of them were relatively weak. Even if they attacked the immortal God Emperor with all their might, it would be difficult for them to pose a threat. On the other hand, the immortal God Emperor's divine techniques could easily injure them. Rather than putting themselves in danger and wasting their divine power, it would be better for them to return to the distorted space-time to recuperate. High up in the sky, only Ji Tianxing and Pan Ri were left, attacking the immortal God Emperor together. Jadefall Overlord watched the battle from afar. He saw Ji Tianxing's pale face and weak divine power. Then he saw the immortal God Emperor's rage, his injuries worsening, and his appearance becoming more and more miserable. Jadefall Overlord sneered, his heart filled with anticipation. He hoped that both sides would collapse as soon as possible, that both sides would suffer heavy losses and be crippled. Of course, it was also full of worry and anxiety. He no longer had any helpers or trump cards, but the immortal God Emperor's palace masters could come to help at any time. The three forces had their own thoughts, and among them, Ji Tianxing was the most anxious. After exchanging dozens of moves with the immortal God Emperor, he saw an opportunity and used the World Destroyer Sword to send the immortal God Emperor flying. Kaboom! Following a deafening explosion, the giant golden sword that was tens of thousands of feet long slammed into the ground after sending the immortal God Emperor flying. A ravine that was hundreds of thousands of miles long was created on the flat ground, extending all the way to the chaotic sea. The earth trembled, and dust covered the sky. The immortal God Emperor's protective divine light was shattered. Blood spurted out from his body as he tumbled and crashed into the ruins hundreds of miles away. While he was still in midair, his chest had already caved in. He opened his mouth and spat out an arrow of blood, letting out a painful cry. No matter how strong he was no match for the World Destroyer Sword condensed from the power of the world. Several more cracks appeared on his already injured body, and many wounds exposed his divine bones. Blood dripped even more profusely. After suffering such injuries, the immortal God Emperor's strength fell sharply, and his battle prowess also plummeted. He flew back more than 100 miles and crashed into the ruins, kicking up a cloud of dust. Ignoring everything else, the immortal God Emperor hurriedly suppressed his chaotic divine power, suppressed his worsening injuries, and adjusted his chaotic aura. Ji Tianxing had long since planned this. When he sent the immortal God Emperor flying with his sword, he took the Prajna God Emperor into the distorted space-time of the Divine Pagoda. At the same time, he used his ultimate skill, Heaven and Earth Incarnation, and disappeared in a flash of white light. He became one with the surrounding 300,000 miles and disappeared right under the noses of the immortal God Emperor and the Lord of Jadefall. The immortal God Emperor had no time to pay attention to anything else, but the Lord of Jadefall witnessed it with his own eyes. It was stunned. Its eyes widened as it stared at the empty sky. It couldn't believe its own eyes. He couldn't figure out how Ji Tianxing had done it. His divine sense could clearly sense that Ji Tianxing's aura was everywhere in this world. But his eyes and divine sense could no longer find any trace of Ji Tianqing. Of course, a short breath later, something even more shocking happened. Ji Tianqing's figure reappeared, but this time, he was 300,000 miles to the north, appearing out of nowhere in the sky. He flew north without hesitation, plunging into the boundless sea of chaos. The Lord of Jade Fall snapped out of his daze and realized that Ji Tianqing had used some sort of ultimate skill to escape. Chapter 4807. It was true that Bai Luo had tricked the immortal God Emperor, but he didn't want to let Ji Tianqing escape either. Thus, when he came to his senses, he charged into the chaos sea without hesitation to kill Ji Tianqing. However, Ji Tianqing was already 300,000 kilometers away from him. With his strength and methods, it was impossible for him to catch up to Ji Tianqing. Unless something happened to Ji Tianqing during his escape. 2 breaths later, the immortal God Emperor also came to his senses. He circulated his energy to suppress his injuries, stabilized his divine power, and angrily charged out of the ruins, returning to the sky. Only then did he realize that Ji Tianqing was nowhere to be seen. Even Bai Luo had flown north. He hurriedly released his divine sense, expanding it to 300,000 kilometers before discovering Ji Tianqing's whereabouts. This stunned him, and his heart was filled with shock and disbelief. Damn it! That brat actually used this divine ability again? Wasn't his divine power already weakened and he was at the end of his rope? Could it be that his previous performance was all an act? At this moment, the immortal God Emperor seemed to have woken up from a dream. He looked down at his injuries, then thought about how Ji Tianqing had first slashed out with a giant sword, then instantly teleported 300,000 kilometers away. He immediately felt humiliated and angry. Even with his strength, status, and knowledge, he had been fooled by Ji Tianqing. This was an utter disgrace. Damn it! Even if you chase me to the depths of the Chaos Sea, I won't let you go. The immortal God Emperor roared, his entire body bursting with killing intent. He shook off the dirt and dust on his body, washing away the bloodstains on his body. He angrily flew north, heading straight for the Chaos Sea. At this moment, a ray of divine light appeared on the southern horizon, gradually growing larger. If one looked closely, they would see that within that ray of divine light was a 3,000-meter-long warship. In just a few short breaths, a second ray of divine light appeared on the horizon. Just like the first beam of divine light, there was also a divine warship inside it. The 2 divine warships were tens of thousands of kilometers apart. They tore through the sky at lightning speed and rushed toward the Chaos Sea. They were only 180,000 kilometers away from the undying God Emperor. The undying God Emperor was about to enter the Chaos Sea when he suddenly used his divine senses to scan the 2 God lights. He discovered the 2 God battleships in the God lights. After being stunned for a moment, he immediately reacted. They've finally arrived. This thought flashed through the undying God Emperor's mind, and his anger subsided a little, as did the anxiety in his heart. That's right, he recognized the 2 divine warships. They belonged to the Hull Masters under his command. His long wait had not been in vain. He had racked his brains to stall for time. Finally, the Hull Masters had arrived. Following this, with the help of the other Palace Masters, as long as he continued to entangle Kenshin, the latter could forget about escaping. However, it was impossible for the undying God Emperor to stop and wait for the Palace Masters to gather. Ji Tianqing was more than 300,000 kilometers away. He could escape at any time. If he stopped flying, Ji Tianqing would be able to escape from the range of his divine senses in 3 breaths' time. He would lose track of him on the spot. The undying God Emperor was already heavily injured. He could not guarantee that he would be able to find Ji Tianqing again after losing track of him. The Chaos Sea was different from land. The scenery here did not change. There were no mountains or rivers, only a boundless blue sea. There were also no traces or clues left behind by the beast race's people in the sea. Once Ji Tianqing left the range of his divine senses and changed his escape route, the undying God Emperor would not be able to find him. He could only speed up and release his divine senses to contact the masters of the two divine warships behind him. Soon, he contacted the second hall master and the fourth hall master. He used his divine senses to transmit to them, "You finally arrived. Just now, I had a great battle with Kenshin. Kenshin was injured by me and used up most of his strength. Unfortunately, that bastard Lord Jadefall got in the way and ruined my plan. Kenshin took the opportunity to escape. I will definitely catch up to Kenshin and capture him. You must follow me with all your strength. You must not lose track of him." The undying God Emperor explained the situation first to increase the confidence of the palace masters and encourage them. Then, he encouraged the palace masters to speed up and catch up. This made the palace masters even more motivated and excited. After hearing his words, the two palace masters hurriedly used their divine senses to reply, "Yes, sir." The fourth hall master was more attentive. He even asked about the undying God Emperor's situation and whether he was injured. In the eyes of the palace masters, this was completely useless flattery. With the undying God Emperor's strength, how could he be injured by Kenshin? However, the undying God Emperor's reply left the palace masters dumbfounded. They found it hard to believe. "I am indeed injured, but it's nothing serious. You don't need to worry. Just keep moving at full speed and don't fall behind." The palace masters immediately became anxious. They hurriedly transmitted to ask what had happened. With the first hall master's strength and methods, how could he be injured by Kenshin? The undying God Emperor didn't explain too much. He only said that Lord Jadefall got in the way and opposed him, so he deserved to die. The palace masters imagined that Lord Jadefall had joined forces with Kenshin to deal with the first hall master, resulting in this outcome. Afterward, the undying God Emperor no longer communicated with the palace masters. The reason was that he didn't want to be distracted. He had to chase after Kenshin with all his strength. The palace masters didn't say anything else. They suppressed a ball of fire in their hearts and kept moving at full speed. In a short while, everyone entered the Chaos Sea and began the tense and dangerous pursuit. What no one knew was that not long after the two divine warships entered the Chaos Sea, another beam of divine light came from the south, streaking across the sky like a bolt of lightning and entering the Chaos Sea. A tall and majestic figure was wrapped in this beam of light. It was the first hall master of the Taiyu Shrine, the Taiyu God Emperor. He was only 400,000 kilometers away from the two divine warships, just within the range of the palace master's consciousness. Therefore, even though he had been chasing after them, the palace masters did not discover his presence. However, he was the strongest of the four sacred halls, the God Emperor. His consciousness's range was far beyond 400,000 kilometers. In truth, he'd caught up to the two divine warships 4 hours ago. However, he didn't know Ji Tianxing's location or tracks, so he could only follow the Pantheon of Immortality's warship. He believed that the Pantheon of Immortality's palace masters had grasped Kenshin's whereabouts. Reality proved him right. When he'd passed through the ruins that stretched for hundreds of thousands of kilometers, he'd guessed that it was the result of the battle between the immortal God Emperor and Kenshin. After all, there were still traces of Kenshin and the immortal God Emperor's auras in the world. He couldn't be wrong. Now that the Pantheon of Immortality's warship was heading straight for the Chaos Sea, it meant that Kenshin had escaped and snuck into the Chaos Sea. Sneering inwardly, the Taiyu God Emperor sped up, no longer lagging behind the two divine warships. Chapter 4808. Before confirming Ji Tianxing's whereabouts and location, Taiyu God Emperor wouldn't reveal himself so easily. He'd already been played by the immortal God Emperor. If he hadn't reacted quickly enough, he might still be searching for Kenshin in the Pantheon of Immortality's territory. That was why he'd been lying low until now. Now that he'd confirmed Ji Tianxing's whereabouts and location, Taiyu God Emperor stopped hiding and sped through the air above the Chaos Sea. Like a shooting star, he overtook the two divine warships and sped towards the north. The hall masters in the two divine warships were all stunned. They hadn't expected a God Emperor to be following them all this time and remain undetected for so long. Moreover, That God Emperor was the one they least wanted to see. Taiyu God Emperor. They knew better than anyone what this meant. Panicking, the four temple lords subconsciously wanted to send a message to the immortal God Emperor. But then they remembered that Taiyu God Emperor and the immortal God Emperor were only a few 100,000 kilometers apart. Even if they didn't say anything, the immortal God Emperor would have detected Taiyu God Emperor's presence long ago. That was indeed the case. When Taiyu God Emperor removed his concealment and revealed his divine power, the immortal God Emperor had already sensed him. He'd been happy and smug earlier that he'd soon be able to capture Kenshin with the help of the temple lords. Now that Emperor God Taiyu had shown up, the situation would become very complicated. His fantasies would be shattered as well. Damn it! Why did Taiyu old man show up at this time? Could it be that he had been following behind the hall masters all this time and only showed himself when I fought with the sword god? He wasn't surprised at all that Taiyu God Emperor had followed him to the Chaos Sea. He'd been mentally prepared for this. Only now did he realize that he had underestimated the craftiness of the universe God Emperor. Unfortunately, since the matter had developed to such an extent, he was unable to change the outcome and situation, and he could only take one step at a time and act according to the circumstances. The most important thing now was to tidy up his appearance and image, as well as adjust his divine power and aura. He couldn't let God Emperor Taiyu notice that he was injured and his strength had dropped. Otherwise, the situation would definitely worsen. Ji Tianxing was at the front of the chasing team. He flew across the sky above the Chaos Sea at lightning speed. If the distance between the two of them increased, he could enter the Chaos Sea and use it to hide his aura and traces. However, he was still within the range of the undying God Emperor's divine sense. This was also the edge of the Chaos Sea. The sea was not deep enough, and there were not enough Sea Clan members in the sea to help him cover. He could only carry out this plan when he entered the depths of the Chaos Sea. Of course, after entering the Chaos Sea, he took out 2 transmission jade slips and sent messages to the 2 sea beast lords as he fled north. These 2 sea beast lords were naturally Xianbing and Zidian. When Ji Tianxing had first entered the Chaos Sea, he'd interacted with Xianbing and Zidian. The two of them had even made a deal. Ji Tianxing had taught them the art of artifact refinement and pointed out problems in their cultivation. In return, they had helped Ji Tianxing gather Emperor-grade artifact refinement materials. After completing the deal, Ji Tianxing had set up the Heaven and Earth Furnace outside their cave abodes to refine the Godslayer battleship and Jiutian 10 Absolutes Tower. He'd even allowed them to observe and learn from him. After Ji Tianxing had left, he'd even left the Heaven and Earth Furnace with them. The relationship between the two of them could not be said to be deep. At the very least, Xianbing and Zidian were grateful and respectful to him. After all, Xianbing and Zidian both knew that Ji Tianxing had another identity, the one chosen by the heavens. Half a year ago, when Ji Tianxing decided to escape to the Chaos Sea, he'd thought of this. He felt that Xianbing and Zidian could be of help to him. Now, he'd send a message to Xianbing and Zidian and tactfully explained his situation. Then he'd asked Xianbing and Zidian to help. Ji Tianxing believed that there was an 80% chance that they would not refuse. As expected, Xianbing and Zidian were both outside the cave abode. They were still controlling the Heaven and Earth Furnace and personally refining Emperor-grade divine artifacts. They were extremely busy. Over the past few years, they had relied on the Heaven and Earth Furnace to refine several Emperor-grade divine artifacts and arm themselves. Now, they had 2 or 3 Emperor-grade divine artifacts with them. Their combat strength had more than doubled compared to before. While enjoying the convenience brought by the Heaven and Earth Furnace, their gratitude towards Ji Tianxing did not fade. Instead, it deepened. They had even discussed that the next time Ji Tianxing came to the Chaos Sea, they had to make him stay in the cave abode for a few more years. Only in this way would they be able to ask Ji Tianxing for advice and answer many of their questions regarding equipment forging and cultivation. Just as they were busy casting spells to refine artifacts, they received a communication jade slip from Ji Tianxing. When they saw that it was a message from Ji Tianxing, the two of them hurriedly stopped refining artifacts and read the contents of the jade slip. After reading it, they understood the cause of the matter and Ji Tianxing's situation. They immediately frowned. Their bodies were filled with anger, and their eyes flickered with a cold light. Damn it! Those bastards from the 4 great sacred halls really don't give up. In the past 10,000 years, no matter how many people they have lost or how many elite soldiers they have lost, they still refuse to give up. The secret of the gate of heavenly Tao is too attractive to them. Longtime is really pitiful. When we first met him, he was being chased all the way. I didn't expect that after a few years, he is still being chased by the experts of the 4 great sacred halls. Maybe he has been running around the continent of origin for the past few years. What should we do? Should we gather a group of elite people to go and help him? The experts of the 2 great sacred halls are chasing him at the same time. There are at least several god emperors and thousands of elite god kings. Even if we have a natural advantage in the Chaos Sea, it is still very dangerous. We might not be able to defeat those experts. Xianbing and Zidian gathered together and communicated with each other using their divine senses. Their expressions were somewhat solemn. This was especially so for Xianbing. His personality was relatively stable. The first thing he thought of was the risk and whether he could resolve it. Zidian's personality was more straightforward. He immediately retorted, "Are you stupid? Who said that we have to fight with the experts of the 2 great sacred halls if we help him? Can't you decide based on the situation and act according to the situation? If we help him resolve the crisis, must we help him kill the hall masters of those sacred halls?" Xianbing fell silent. After thinking carefully for a moment, he slowly nodded and said, "Yes, what you said makes sense. Let's start now." Zidian was even more enthusiastic. He hurriedly nodded in agreement and turned to leave the heaven and earth furnace to gather the elite god kings under him. Chapter 4809. In less than 2 hours, the 2 lords had gathered 6,000 elite God King realm sea beasts and left the cave abode. They rushed to the south in a mighty manner, speeding through the Chaos Sea as fast as lightning. Along the way, countless sea beasts were alarmed. They looked at them suspiciously, guessing what had happened. After traveling for a while, Xianbing and Zidian started to communicate telepathically. Zidian had thought of an idea. "Xianbing, have you ever thought that if we call Blue Dragon and Yu Bingxin to help us, wouldn't it be easier?" Xianbing quickly replied, "Of course I have thought about it, but we have some friendship with Longtime. It would be unreasonable if we don't help him. But Lan Long and Yu Bingxin don't seem to have any friendship with him. Would they be willing to do such a dangerous thing?" Zidian waved her hand and said, "If you don't ask them, how do you know they won't be willing? Also, you can tell them that Longtime is the one chosen by heaven. I believe that they will make the right choice after hearing this news." Xianbing thought for a while and felt that Zidian's words made sense. He nodded and agreed. Then he started to contact Lan Long and Yu Bingxin. The result was just as Zidian expected. After an hour, Lan Long and Yu Bingxin sent back a message, saying that they were willing to lead the elite sea beasts to rescue Longtime. The reason why they took an hour to reply was not because the transmission speed was too slow. It was because after Lan Long and Yu Bingxin received the news, they thought about it for a long time before deciding to rescue Longtime. Although the news of Longtime being the one chosen by heaven was shocking and unbelievable, they believed Lan Long and Yu Bingxin. However, they believed in the words of Black Ice and Purple Lightning. They knew that the 2 lords would not lie. Moreover, Lan Long and Yu Bingxin had met Longtime before. They knew his strength and methods. Since their target was the one chosen by heaven, and they were like Xianbing and Zidian, they had the responsibility of guarding the Chaos Sea, stopping the 4 great temples, and protecting the gate of heavenly Tao. The heaven's chosen one was in danger and was being hunted down by the powerhouses of the 2 major temples. Of course, they had to provide support and protection. After all, they were also worried about a problem. If they knew that the chosen one was being hunted down and ignored it, would they incur the wrath of the heavens and be punished by the heavens? Ji Tianxing was still flying above the Chaos Sea at lightning speed. After he sent a message to Xianbing and Zidian, he received a reply within an hour. Xianbing and Zidian were very straightforward and told him very clearly that they would gather their men and immediately set off to help. Upon receiving this news, Ji Tianxing secretly heaved a sigh of relief and felt slightly relieved. Only now did he feel that helping Xianbing and Zidian back then was worth it. At that moment, he had already been flying in the Chaos Sea for half a day. 300,000 miles behind him, the Undying God Emperor was in hot pursuit. And about 50,000 miles behind the Undying God Emperor, the Jade Fall Monarch was also rushing with all his might. When they first entered the Chaos Sea, the Jade Fall Monarch was the closest to Ji Tianxing while the Undying God Emperor was right behind him. But after chasing for half a day, the Undying God Emperor still managed to overtake the Jade Fall Monarch with his powerful strength and left him in the dust. Unfortunately, the Undying God Emperor was injured and his strength had dropped considerably. No matter how hard he chased, he couldn't catch up to Ji Tianxing. Every time the two closed the distance between them, Ji Tianxing would use Boundless Step to quickly increase the distance between them. For the Undying God Emperor, he was already very happy that he was able to maintain a certain distance from Ji Tianxing and not be shaken off. As for the Universe God Emperor, he was currently behind the Jade Fall Monarch, about 50,000 miles away. In other words, he was 150,000 miles away from the Undying God Emperor and 450,000 miles away from Ji Tianxing. Although Ji Tianxing was outside the range of his consciousness, he was still able to detect him. But he could already detect the aura of divine power left behind by Ji Tianxing in the sky. This made him even more motivated and confident that he could overtake the Jade Fall Monarch and the Undying God Emperor to catch Ji Tianxing. As time passed, the distance between him and the Jade Fall Monarch gradually shortened. And about 100,000 miles behind him, the two Pantheon of Immortality warships were gradually being shaken off. Although they were already doing their best to control the warships to their maximum speed, it was useless. The God Emperor experts at the front of the warships, with the exception of the Jade Fall Monarch, were all faster than the warships. The slowest and most anxious of all were the Taiyu Shrine's temple lords. They were also controlling two warships and speeding through the Chaos Sea. However, the distance between them and Ji Tianxing's group was more than 10 million miles. In other words, unless Ji Tianxing's group stopped and fought for 2 hours, they would have a chance to catch up. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to catch up. 2 days passed by quickly. Ji Tianxing was still at the front of the pursuing group. No one had caught up to him. However, the ranks of the pursuing group behind him had changed. The one closest to him was still the Undying God Emperor, still 300,000 miles away. Taiyu God Emperor had already overtaken the Jade Fall Monarch and caught up to the Undying God Emperor. The two were now only 40,000 miles apart. When Taiyu God Emperor overtook the Jade Fall Monarch, the latter's emotions were very complicated. He had guessed Taiyu God Emperor's identity and had considered attacking to stall the God Emperor for a moment. But on second thought, he realized that doing so wouldn't do him any good. On the contrary, he would make a powerful enemy. Moreover, doing so would only benefit the Undying God Emperor, which was equivalent to helping the God Emperor in disguise. After thinking it over, the Jade Fall Monarch resisted the urge to attack and allowed Taiyu God Emperor to fly past him. Taiyu God Emperor wasn't someone to be trifled with. As he approached the Jade Fall Monarch, he was on guard against any possible attacks. Of course, he didn't think much of the Jade Fall Monarch. However, he was also worried that an ambush would delay him. Fortunately, the Jade Fall Monarch was tactful and didn't attack him. Only then did he drop his guard and quickly overtake the Jade Fall Monarch. Unfortunately, this chase was destined to last for a long time. It wouldn't end quickly. The temple lords under Taiyu God Emperor's command were too far away to be of any help. He was facing Ji Tianxing, the Undying God Emperor, the Jade Fall Monarch, and the Pantheon of Immortality alone. How could he act rashly? He could only hurry along and gradually shorten the distance between them. He hoped to catch up to Ji Tianxing as soon as possible so that he could observe Ji Tianxing's situation. Time passed quietly. 3 days later, there was a slight change in the rankings of the pursuers. The change was mainly due to Taiyu God Emperor. He had already caught up to the immortal God Emperor and was now running side by side with him. The distance between them was about 300,000 miles. Chapter 48:10. Taiyu God Emperor and the Immortal God Emperor traveled side by side, maintaining a distance of 30,000 kilometers between them. This distance was relatively safe for both parties. Even if one of them were to ambush the other would have enough time to react. Of course, the premise was that both of them were on guard against each other. And that was indeed the case. Both of them used their consciousnesses to keep an eye on Ji Tianxing while remaining on guard against each other. At first, both of them were silent and expressionless, unwilling to communicate through voice transmissions. But in the end, Taiyu God Emperor couldn't take it anymore and sent a message to the Immortal God Emperor. "Immortal, you bastard, you're truly despicable and untrustworthy." He was still holding a grudge against the Immortal God Emperor for what had happened before. Not only would he remember this, but he also hated the Immortal God Emperor. Now wasn't the time to settle the score, but he wouldn't let it go just like that. The Immortal God Emperor glanced sideways at him and sneered contemptuously. "Don't play dumb with me, old man Taiyu. This is human nature. If it were you, you wouldn't have shared information with me after discovering Kenshin's whereabouts either. This so-called alliance has no basis for trust, nor is it binding." Although the Immortal God Emperor was speaking the truth, Taiyu God Emperor refused to admit it. He had to stand on the moral high ground and harshly criticize the Immortal God Emperor. Only then could he confidently negotiate terms and suppress the Immortal God Emperor. "Immortal, you've turned shamelessness into a habit that's second nature. You and I are both God Emperor, peerless powerhouses who rule over millions of people. How could you commit such a treacherous act? Do you think I'm as despicable and shameless as you? My prestige and dignity won't allow me to commit such a shameless act. You must apologize to me and compensate me accordingly. Only then will I forgive you. Otherwise, I'll remember this and make you pay for it sooner or later." "Don't even think about it." The Immortal God Emperor snorted disdainfully and turned away, too lazy to pay attention to Taiyu God Emperor. However, Taiyu God Emperor wasn't about to let the matter drop. He chased after Taiyu and gave him a good scolding before his anger subsided somewhat. The Immortal God Emperor suppressed his anger and kept his silence. He'd thought that the great Universe God Emperor would stop prattling on, but he didn't. However, Emperor Taiyu didn't want to end the conversation. He moved on to the next topic. "You bastard, you want to take all the fruits of your labor for yourself, capture the Sword God for yourself, and enjoy the secret of immortality for yourself. By you. Didn't you fight a few rounds with the Sword God? And those good-for-nothings under your command are also useless and incompetent. They can't even catch up to the Sword God, let alone capture him." Taiyu God Emperor wasn't just criticizing the Immortal God Emperor, but also the pantheon of immortality's temple lords. The Immortal God Emperor couldn't hold back his anger any longer. He glared at Taiyu God Emperor and roared, "Taiyu, you dare look down on me? I did fight with the Sword God before, but the Beast Overlord also participated in the battle. That despicable Beast Overlord joined forces with Kenshin to fight me. Plus, do you think Kenshin is alone? He has 3 God Emperor powerhouses by his side. Even if you were to take action personally, you wouldn't be able to gain any advantage against 5 Emperor Gods, let alone me. As for the Temple Lords under me, they fell behind to begin with. So what if they can't catch up to Kenshin? I don't even know where your Temple Lords are right now. They probably haven't even entered the Chaos Sea yet. Doesn't that mean they're worse than trash?" The Immortal God Emperor roared in anger. Only after roaring so many words in one breath did the anger in his heart ease a lot. Taiyu God Emperor's original intention wasn't to ridicule the Immortal God Emperor, but to gather information in a roundabout way. In the end, the Immortal God Emperor's cultivation was still a bit weak. He couldn't take insults and provocations and revealed a lot of information. Taiyu God Emperor sneered in his mind, that Beast Overlord really does have his own ideas. He's not an idiot either, he knows how to weigh the situation. If he had attacked Kenshin back then, that bastard Immortal would have succeeded. It seems he's doing this because he wants Kenshin. Does he also want the secret of immortality? Barbarians, uncivilized beasts. How dare he try to steal food from the tiger's mouth? He really doesn't know the immensity of heaven and earth. As for the fact that Immortal was surrounded by several God Emperor, that seems to be true. Otherwise, he wouldn't be so angry. But with his meager strength, how could he possibly withstand the attacks of several God Emperor and come out unscathed? At this thought, Taiyu God Emperor couldn't help but size up the Immortal God Emperor. His sharp eyes seemed to see through the other. After venting his anger, the Immortal God Emperor calmed down a lot. It was only when he noticed that Emperor God Taiyu seemed to be lost in thought and the corner of his mouth curled into a meaningful smirk that he snapped back to reality. Damn it! He's trying to get information from me. The Immortal God Emperor's humiliation turned into anger. He couldn't help but curse Taiyu God Emperor for being despicable. Taiyu God Emperor wasn't angry. He waved his hand and said seriously, "Immortal, things have already developed to this point. There's no point in saying anything now. Anger is even more pointless. If I'm not mistaken, you're already injured. There's no need to force yourself." Seeing the Immortal God Emperor grow even angrier and want to argue, Taiyu God Emperor smiled and said, "All right, there's no need to argue with me. In your current state, it's almost impossible for you to catch up to Kenshin. Once I catch up to Kenshin, you'll most likely try to interfere. This is just like what you did when you fought against the Sword God, the Orc Overlord. In the end, no one will be able to catch Kenshin. He'll only be able to escape. You know very well that this is the Chaos Sea. The deeper we go, the greater the variables. Let's not waste any more time. Let's continue our alliance and cooperate. Let's catch Kenshin first." The Immortal God Emperor was stunned when he heard the last sentence. He looked at Taiyu God Emperor in disbelief. After confirming that Taiyu God Emperor wasn't joking, he asked, "I've already broken my oath and agreement. Don't you hate me? Why do you want to cooperate with me now? Are you trying to trick me into trusting you and take revenge?" The Immortal God Emperor didn't dare to trust or hope the cunning Taiyu God Emperor. He wasn't afraid to use the greatest malice to guess what Taiyu God Emperor was thinking. Taiyu God Emperor was still smiling. He said calmly, "You're right. There's no basis for cooperation or trust between us. However, we have the same goal and the same sense of danger. Now that the situation has developed to this point, we can no longer act willfully. Only by putting aside our differences and working together can we catch Kenshin as soon as possible. As for how we'll split the profits, I understand. Even if I suggest a plan, you won't believe me. Let's wait until we catch the Sword God, and then we'll fight with our own abilities." Chapter 48:11. The Undying God Emperor was pleased by Taiyu God Emperor's frank words. Even if Taiyu God Emperor hadn't said it aloud, the Undying God Emperor understood. In his current state, he couldn't catch up to Kenshin, and even if he did, he might not be able to defeat him. Moreover, he and Taiyu God Emperor were bound to obstruct each other and complicate matters further. Only by working together would they be able to capture Kenshin as quickly as possible. As for who Kenshin would belong to after Kenshin was captured, the Undying God Emperor was quite confident. After all, the 4 temple lords under his command weren't far behind and would be able to come to his aid very soon. The temple lords of the Taiyu Shrine, on the other hand, were definitely far away and wouldn't be able to make it in time. When the time came, he and the 4 temple lords would work together while Taiyu God Emperor would fight alone. There would be no doubt as to who would emerge victorious. It was with this in mind that the Undying God Emperor felt that working together would be very beneficial for him. That was why he agreed to the proposal. Similarly, Taiyu God Emperor was confident that the Undying God Emperor would accept the offer because he had guessed the Undying God Emperor's intentions. The Immortal God Emperor pretended to be solemn. After a moment of deep thought, he nodded and said, "All right, since the great Universe God Emperor has let bygones be bygones and is willing to cooperate with me, then I'll cooperate with you one more time. I'm not an ignorant person. Don't worry, what happened before won't happen again. We should trust each other's sincerity. Then it's a deal. Taiyu God Emperor grinned meaningfully. After reaching an agreement verbally, the two sides began to discuss their next course of action. Previously, both of them were afraid of each other. Even though they were chasing after Ji Tianxing with all their strength, they still held back and didn't reveal their trump cards. However, things were different now. Since the two of them were working together, they had to do their best to capture Kenshin. Taiyu God Emperor was the first to speak. Unmai, since you're injured, take care of your wounds first. I'll go ahead and keep Kenshin busy. You can follow me later. With that, Taiyu God Emperor used a teleportation god art and disappeared from the spot. Shwa. With a flash of white light, Taiyu God Emperor disappeared into thin air and reappeared hundreds of thousands of kilometers away. The distance between him and Ji Tianxing was instantly shortened to a few 100,000 miles. At this moment, he was between Ji Tianxing and the Undying God Emperor, the same distance between them. The Undying God Emperor examined Zhongyu with his divine sense and sneered in his heart. Damned grand space. Did he really think he was invincible? I'll let you be arrogant for a while. Once we capture Kenshin, I'll make sure you regret it. Regarding this cooperation, he was determined to succeed and was full of confidence. On the other side, Taiyu God Emperor was also sneering in his heart. He despised the Undying God Emperor's actions. Undying, you bastard. You can't be considered shrewd, but you're certainly cunning. But with just this bit of ability, aren't you still being pinched to death by this seat? Do you think that just because those 4 trashy palace masters are following behind you, you have the confidence to snatch the sword god from me? How naive. The best part is yet to come. Let's wait and see. With these thoughts flashing through his mind, Taiyu God Emperor sped up and released his divine sense to cover Ji Tianxing in front of him. He observed Ji Tianxing's condition. He'd thought that Ji Tianxing would be injured after his battle with the Undying God Emperor. After all, if the Undying God Emperor was injured, how could a mid-level God Emperor come out unscathed? However, after some observation, Taiyu God Emperor found that Ji Tianxing was full of divine energy and his aura was stable. He showed no signs of injury. Moreover, Ji Tianxing noticed that Taiyu God Emperor was only a few 100,000 kilometers away. He immediately felt a sense of danger and urgency. He didn't hesitate to use Boundless Step to move 150,000 kilometers forward. This increased the distance between him and Taiyu God Emperor to 300,000 kilometers. Taiyu God Emperor had expected Ji Tianxing to use this ability and was mentally prepared for the fact that he wouldn't be able to catch up to Ji Tianxing within a day. He could only maintain his full speed and wait for 15 minutes before using spatial shift again. At this time, the Undying God Emperor was more than 400,000 kilometers away from Ji Tianxing. This was beyond the range of his divine sense. Unable to detect Ji Tianxing's aura, the Undying God Emperor was very anxious. He couldn't care less about his injuries. He hurriedly used the space-shifting technique and teleported hundreds of thousands of miles forward. Only by bringing Ji Tianxing into the range of his divine sense and monitoring Ji Tianxing's every move could he feel at ease. For the next half a day, the two parties were in hot pursuit. Basically, every 15 minutes or so, Ji Tianxing would perform the so close, yet so far skill and teleport himself to a distance of 150,000 miles. Taiyu God Emperor followed closely behind and also used spatial shift every 15 minutes. The two of them had different ultimate skills, but the casting time and distance of the spatial shift were basically the same. From this, it could be seen that Ji Tianxing was indeed a genius. There was no other person like him in the world. After all, Emperor God Taiyu's cultivation was much higher than his. If it had been any other God Emperor at Ji Tianxing's level, Taiyu God Emperor would have long since caught up and given him a good beating. He would have been on the verge of death by now. However, Taiyu God Emperor hadn't caught up to him. The two parties had maintained a distance of 200,000 kilometers, which wasn't easy at all. As for the Undying God Emperor, he had gone all out during this half a day. His injuries hadn't healed, and he only had around 70% of his strength left. In order to not be shaken off by Kenshin and Taiyu God Emperor, He had to keep up with them and use spatial shift every 30 minutes. This left him even weaker and more exhausted. His divine power had been greatly depleted, and his battle prowess had dropped even further. Even so, Taiyu God Emperor still managed to leave him in the dust. The two sides were now 300,000 kilometers apart. As for the monarch of Jadefall and the pantheon of immortality, they were in an even worse state. They were so desperate that they wanted to give up. When Ji Tianxing, Taiyu, and Immortal chased after them with all their might, they quickly left them in the dust. In half a day's time, the distance between them and the three emperor gods had increased to over 1 million miles. Not to mention using their consciousness to detect the traces of the three emperor gods, even the divine aura that the three emperor gods left behind in the sky was difficult for them to detect. Before the undying god emperor gave the order, they could only keep going north. They didn't dare change direction or stop. As time passed, the hunting party gradually entered the depths of the Chaos Sea. The color of the sea gradually changed from azure to dark blue. By the time the sea turned dark blue, they would have reached the depths of the Chaos Sea. There would be countless sea beasts there. There would be God King Realm sea beasts everywhere. There might even be God Emperor Realm ancient sea beasts. Chapter 48:12. A day passed in the blink of an eye. Ji Tianxing, the Taiyu God Emperor, and the Immortal God Emperor left everyone else in the dust. The two divine ships of the Firmament Monarch and the Immortal Shrine had been flying side by side the entire time, but now they were several million kilometers behind. The pantheon of Immortality's temple lords were astonished. They found it hard to believe that the Lord of Jadefall had chased Kenshin this far on his own. He had no helpers or several thousand god kings under his command. Why would he join in the fun? With its meager strength, did it really think it could compete with the two great temples for the sword god and get a share of the loot? That was ridiculous. The temple lords found the Lord of Jadefall's actions laughable and discussed him many times. However, they didn't dare attack the Lord of Jadefall. They didn't want to waste time and affect the first temple lord's grand plan. However, the Lord of Jadefall didn't know this. He only knew that he'd paid too much in pursuit of Kenshin. Since he'd chased him all the way to the Chaos Sea, what reason did he have to give up? Even if he couldn't compete with the two temples or defeat Kenshin, he could at least follow to the end and see how things would end. Did the experts of the two temples succeed, or did the sword god escape and hide in the primal Chaos Sea, causing the two temples to return empty-handed? In the end, anything was possible. As long as he didn't give up, there was always hope. If things developed to the point where both the temple masters and the sword god were severely injured and lost their ability to fight, wouldn't that be its chance? In short, the Lord of Jadefall felt that after a lifetime of struggle, this was his one and only chance. He'd never be able to forgive himself if he didn't try. More than 10 million kilometers behind, in the sky above the Chaos Sea, there were also two divine warships speeding at high speed. They were the two divine ships of the Cosmos Temple. They were the ships of the second and third Hallmasters. As for the fourth and fifth temple lords, they'd always been by the Taiyu God Emperor's side. The second palace master and the third palace master also knew that they had been left far behind. They would not be able to catch up in a short period of time. However, Taiyu God Emperor had sent word that they had caught up to the Kenshin and would be able to stall for time. Therefore, the second and third palace masters didn't dare to give up on the chase. They sped up even more in hopes of catching up to Kenshin and cheering for Taiyu God Emperor. In the depths of the Chaos Sea that no one could see, a storm was brewing. Xianbing and Zidian led 6,000 divine king realm sea beasts towards the south, creating huge waves in the sea. Countless aquatic beasts were startled, and they were both shocked and confused as they tried to guess what had happened. As for Blue Dragon and Yu Bingxin, who were closer, they had also gathered thousands of elite sea beasts and were rushing south at lightning speed. They couldn't contact Ji Tianxing, so they didn't know what Ji Tianxing's situation was. This made them even more worried and anxious. Perhaps they would have to travel for another 7 or 8 days before encountering Kenshin. However, in order to find out more about Ji Tianxing's situation as soon as possible, they gave orders to the sea beast leaders in the southernmost part of their territory. The orders were simple. They were to gather the Divine King Realm's sea beasts under their command and search for Kenshin and the others in the southernmost part of their territory. If Kenshin was safe and sound, the leaders didn't need to act. If Kenshin was in danger or surrounded by the experts of the two temples, the leaders would have to help. Even if they couldn't defeat the two temple lords, they could at least use their advantage in numbers and environment to create trouble for the experts of the two temples and reduce the pressure on Kenshin. After the orders were issued, the 10-some leaders at the southern border immediately complied and began to move out. Ji Tianxing, the Universe God Emperor, and the Immortal God Emperor were unaware of all this. Although this long and drawn-out pursuit that covered a distance of over several 100 million miles appeared to be very dangerous, Chu Feng was still able to sense the danger. The slightest mistake on Ji Tianxing's part would put him in mortal danger. At best, he would be captured by the two temples and at worst, lose his life on the spot. However, he had always been cautious in his actions and had relied on his immense strength to stall for so long. Now that the situation had developed to this point, at least 40% of the danger had been resolved. The only people who could threaten him were the Immortal God Emperor and the Universe God Emperor. The monarch of Jadefall and the two temple lords posed no threat to him, nor could they catch up to him in the short term. The Immortal God Emperor was already injured and had been traveling at full speed. He had no time to heal his wounds or recover his divine power. His threat to Ji Tianxing right now had already dropped to a very low level. In fact, he no longer had any advantage against Ji Tianxing. Forget about capturing or defeating Ji Tianxing, he might not even be a match for Ji Tianxing. The only person who truly posed the greatest threat to Ji Tianxing was the Universe God Emperor. There was nothing that could be done about it. He was the leader of the four temples and was known to be second only to the mysterious forefather. He was the expert most likely to attain eternal life. Moreover, he had yet to fight Ji Tianxing and was still in peak condition. Whether it was in terms of strength, cultivation, or foundation, Ji Tianxing felt that he was unfathomable. Ji Tianxing couldn't outrun or fight him and might very well die at his hands in the end. They chased each other for 2 days. Every time he used so near, yet worlds apart, God Emperor Tai Yu would use spatial shift. Whenever he teleported hundreds of thousands of kilometers, the Universe God Emperor would do the same. This alone made it impossible for Ji Tianxing to shake off the Universe God Emperor. Moreover, even without using spatial shift, the Universe God Emperor's flight speed still surpassed Ji Tianxing's. The distance between the two narrowed with each passing day. After 2 days of pursuit, the distance between them had shrunk to 50,000 kilometers. In a few more hours, the Universe God Emperor would be able to catch up to Ji Tianxing and unleash divine arts on him. At this time, the Immortal God Emperor was still bitterly chasing after him. He wasn't in the best of shape and his combat strength was constantly declining. He looked rather haggard. Even under normal circumstances, he couldn't match up to Ji Tianxing or the Universe God Emperor. Even if he used spatial shift, his casting speed and distance couldn't compare to the two of them. Thus, it was only natural that he'd be shaken off by Ji Tianxing and the Universe God Emperor. After 2 days, he'd been left behind by nearly 1,000,000 kilometers. Fortunately, Ji Tianxing and the Universe God Emperor had been traveling in a straight line, or he really might have lost them. Another few hours passed. On the morning of the 3rd day, the Universe God Emperor and Ji Tianxing had finally shrunk to 20,000 kilometers. The Universe God Emperor couldn't wait any longer. He decisively used his divine arts and attacked Ji Tianxing. However, no one noticed that they'd already entered Blue Dragon and Yu Bingxin's territory. Chapter 48:13. Swish, swish, swish. Ji Tianxing was flying through the sky when he heard the sound of something tearing through the air behind him. He didn't need to look back. He had been using his divine sense to monitor his surroundings, so he naturally knew that it was the sound of a dozen blades of divine light. This was the first time Tai Yu God Emperor and Ji Tianxing had clashed head-on. It was also Ji Tianxing's first time seeing the other party in action. Those ordinary-looking blades of divine light were all thousands of feet long and multicolored. There was nothing special about them apart from the runes and Dao auras surrounding them. However, Ji Tianxing had a very deep and intense feeling. Those blades of divine light were definitely the most powerful attack he had ever faced. He didn't dare to be careless, so he hurriedly took out the sword of burial of heaven to meet the enemy. Fortunately, he wasn't injured. With the 5-elemental world and the heaven-mending pearl as his backup, he could continuously replenish his divine power. Fighting Emperor God Tai Yu in such a state would give him a boost of confidence. Sword cleaving the 9 heavens. Ji Tianxing gripped the sword of burial of heaven with both hands and unleashed a 3,000-foot-long golden sword at Tai Yu God Emperor. The next moment, the golden sword swept through the sky and met the dozen blades of divine light head-on. A deafening explosion erupted and reverberated across the sea. The golden sword and the 12 blades of divine light collapsed at the same time, exploding into countless fragments of divine light that rained down on the surface of the chaotic sea. Violent shockwaves spread out in all directions, blowing away the vast sea of clouds and creating giant waves thousands of feet tall on the surface of the chaotic sea. However, there were still 2 blades of divine light that managed to evade the golden sword and went straight for Ji Tianxing. They were too close for Ji Tianxing to evade in time and was struck by the 2 blades of divine light. However, he was already prepared for this. He had already formed a barrier of divine light and raised his defense to the maximum. Bang! Bang! With 2 muffled sounds, the 2 divine light blades slammed into the divine light shield, splashing out countless fragments of divine light. The divine light blade shattered on the spot. Ji Tianxing's divine light shield was also destroyed, and several cracks appeared on it. The incomparably powerful impact sent him flying backwards, tumbling into the sea a few hundred miles away. While he was still flying in the air, Ji Tianxing could clearly sense that although the divine light blade had been shattered, there were still a few strands of invisible Daoist aura that pierced through the divine light shield and into his body like sharp thorns. A total of 5 auras pierced through his body like needles, easily penetrating his body's defenses and drilling into his meridians and blood vessels. They were swimming rapidly, converging towards his heart and mind. Wherever the 5 auras passed, his meridians and blood vessels were cut and injured. The piercing pain caused his entire body to convulse, tremble, and break out in a dense cold sweat. Once the 5 auras entered his heart, they would definitely grind his heart to pieces and kill his divine body on the spot. Once the auras entered his sea of consciousness, not only would his sea of consciousness be destroyed, he would lose his rationality and consciousness, and even his divine spark might be destroyed. At this moment, Ji Tianxing was in an extremely perilous situation. Only now did he realize just how powerful the Tai Yu God Emperor was. The Tai Yu God Emperor hadn't even used his trump card in the first exchange. He had only used 100% of his power, yet he had already injured Tang Wulin. One could imagine that when the Tai Yu God Emperor went all out, Tang Wulin was definitely not a match. Ji Tianxing didn't have the time to think too much at such a critical juncture. Even though he was still floating in the air above the sea, he wasn't in a hurry to stabilize his body. Instead, he circulated his energy to eliminate the 5 auras. Fortunately, he was powerful enough and his divine Dao foundation was stable enough. When the 5 auras were about to reach his heart and mind, he successfully intercepted them and circulated his energy to force them out of his body. Whoosh whoosh whoosh. 5 invisible auras shot out like sharp swords and slammed into the sea, creating several earth-shattering explosions and raging waves tens of thousands of feet tall. The sky within a 10,000-kilometer radius was covered by water vapor and waves. Ji Tianxing flew back 300 kilometers before dispelling the terrifying impact. He landed on a 10,000-meter-tall wave and came to a steady stop. He soared into the sky again and finally saw the halo of divine power around the Tai Yu God Emperor. There were exactly 8 different Daoist auras of different colors. They were like rings of light, making the Tai Yu God Emperor appear extremely majestic, mysterious, and powerful. 8 Daoist auras of the upper stage of the God Emperor. No wonder he's known as the most powerful being of the 4 sacred halls, second only to the mysterious patriarch. He's the one with the most hope of attaining eternal life. Ji Tianxing frowned. A cold light flashed in his eyes as he muttered to himself. The Taiyu God Emperor was the most powerful enemy he'd ever faced in his life. He had to be 120% focused to deal with him. Before he could think any further, the Taiyu God Emperor had caught up and attacked again. Destruction Reincarnation. Emperor God Taiyu took out a palm-wide, dark gold divine sword. He held it with both hands and slashed down from the sky with a 10,000-meter-long slash. The dark golden divine sword was extremely heavy and majestic, as if it had been born from heaven and earth. It contained a supreme might. The Taiyu God Emperor only took one step forward, but he traveled 10,000 kilometers in an instant and closed in on Ji Tianxing. The enormous five-colored sword that was over 30 kilometers long contained 1,200 types of divine Dao laws and 5 types of Dao auras. This was also the full power of the Taiyu God Emperor. It was a strike filled with confidence. Unlike the unparalleled sharpness of the first combat art, this one's specialty lay in its overwhelming power, intimidating the heart with the might of heaven and earth, and destroying all things. Anyone would feel that the Taiyu God Emperor was the embodiment of heaven and earth, the model of divinity. He represented justice and judged evil. Ji Tianxing felt an enormous pressure. He felt as if the space within 10,000 kilometers had frozen, making it impossible for him to move. It was impossible for him to dodge the attack. The only thing he could do was to use all his strength and swing the sword of burial of heaven to meet the attack head-on. There was nothing he could do about it. The Taiyu God Emperor was forcing him into a head-on confrontation and defeating him fair and square. Any opportunistic tricks would be useless. Sword of Destruction. Ji Tianxing held the Heaven-Burier sword with both hands and raised it high above his head. With a furious roar, he recklessly slashed out a giant golden sword that was tens of thousands of meters long. It was also a giant sword, but it glowed with golden light. It was more dazzling than the sun and more sacred and majestic than heaven and earth. At this moment, Ji Tianxing's aura was even more imposing and majestic than the Taiyu God Emperor's. He was more representative of the heavenly Tao. The aura of someone chosen by heaven surged out of him. Boom! Crack! In the next moment, the two enormous swords collided fiercely in the sky, erupting with an earth-shaking bang that was deafening to the ears. The terrifying impact knocked both Ji Tianxing and the Taiyu God Emperor back several hundred kilometers. The two giant swords shattered at the same time. Chapter 48:14. Taiyu God Emperor was stunned by this outcome. He couldn't believe that Ji Tianxing had neutralized the ultimate skill he'd unleashed with all his power. He'd thought that since the first skill had wounded Ji Tianxing, the second would be enough to heavily injure him. If he used the third move, he would definitely be able to heavily injure the other party to the point that the other party would lose the ability to fight and be captured by him. As the number one expert of the 4 sacred halls, he naturally had the means and confidence to do so. However, Ji Tianxing had neutralized his attack and remained unscathed. This came as a complete shock to him. He simply couldn't believe that Ji Tianxing had such means and strength. A mere mid-level God Emperor with only 6 Daoist rhymes has such strength and means? No wonder everyone thinks he's the chosen one. He's truly extraordinary. Taiyu God Emperor was an upper-level God Emperor with 8 Daoist rhymes, 2 levels higher than his opponent. He should have been able to crush his opponent. Ji Tianxing was actually quite surprised and even found it hard to believe. The Armageddon sword was his most powerful trump card. In the past, whenever he faced a strong enemy, he could always defeat or even kill them by using this trump card. But now, this ultimate skill could only neutralize Taiyu God Emperor's attack without harming him in the slightest. One could only imagine how powerful Taiyu God Emperor was. With his current strength, he was no match for Taiyu God Emperor at all. If this continued, he'd definitely meet a tragic end. Thus, Ji Tianxing borrowed the powerful impact and decisively retreated into the distance. He didn't even look back. He used Boundless Step and disappeared in a flash of white light, appearing 150,000 kilometers away in the next instant. Seeing how fast Ji Tianxing was and how unaffected he was, Taiyu God Emperor knew that his divine power was still abundant and that he wasn't injured at all. This surprised him and made him feel even more disdain for the Undying God Emperor. Didn't that trash Bumye fight with the Sword God? Undying is injured, so why is Kenshin unharmed and still full of divine power? Is he so useless that he can't even beat Kenshin? Taiyu God Emperor frowned, his eyes flashing with cold light. There was no need to hesitate. Ji Tianxing had already fled north. He could only use a spatial shift to give chase. With a flash of white light, Taiyu God Emperor disappeared from the sky and appeared 150,000 kilometers to the north in the next instant. The distance between him and Ji Tianxing had increased by another 50,000 kilometers. It would take some time before he could catch up. As for the Immortal God Emperor, he took advantage of the time the two of them were fighting to close the distance between them, reducing the distance between them to about 1 million miles. Although he couldn't see what was happening up ahead, when he passed by the area where Ji Tianxing and Taiyu God Emperor were fighting, he sensed the remnants of violent divine power and Daoist rhymes in the air. He didn't need to guess to know that these were the traces left behind by the battle between Ji Tianxing and Taiyu God Emperor. This filled him with anticipation. He secretly speculated about the result of the battle between Ji Tianxing and Taiyu God Emperor, and whether or not the two were injured. Of course, he was wondering who was injured. However, logic told him that only Kenshin could be injured. Taiyu God Emperor was an upper-level God Emperor. How could he be injured? Since he couldn't catch up to Ji Tianxing and Taiyu God Emperor, it meant that the battle hadn't been going on for too long and had ended long ago. He muttered in his heart and secretly looked down on Taiyu God Emperor. Number 1 of the 4 sacred temples? What a load of crap. You bragged so much before. I thought you'd be able to catch up to Kenshin easily. Who would have thought that's all you've got? You still can't do anything to Kenshin. Since Taiyu God Emperor had also failed, the Undying God Emperor sneered in his heart. He felt comforted and the pressure on him lessened significantly. He wasn't in as much of a hurry as before. He traveled at a leisurely pace while circulating his energy to heal his injuries. He even took some healing pills. He even had the time to send a message to the hall masters under his command, explaining the current situation to them and inquiring about their location and situation. Taiyu God Emperor and Ji Tianxing were still chasing each other in the sky. Just like before, they would use a spatial shift every 15 minutes or so. Both of them had deep foundations and didn't feel tired no matter how long they chased each other. Their divine energy was still abundant. However, Taiyu God Emperor was faster than Ji Tianxing and was destined to catch up. Time slowly passed. Unknowingly, another 2 hours had passed. Taiyu God Emperor was fast enough to catch up to Ji Tianxing and close the gap to 20,000 kilometers. He didn't hesitate to use his arts and techniques to attack Ji Tianxing again. Again, he used his full power and swung his sacred golden broadsword, unleashing several streaks of earth-shattering sword light that locked onto Ji Tianxing's aura and slashed down from the sky. This time, Taiyu God Emperor had seen Ji Tianxing's methods and was prepared. When he launched the attack, he even used his ultimate skill to seal the space within a radius of 30,000 miles. He would rather use a portion of his divine energy to seal off the space around Ji Tianxing and prevent him from escaping. This move was indeed effective. Ji Tianxing was suppressed by an invisible force and the space around him was also frozen. There was no way for him to dodge. Looking at the 4 streaks of sword light descending from the sky, he had no choice but to use his ultimate arts and techniques to face them head-on. Rising Dragon Slash. Sky-piercing finger. He swung the sword of burial of heaven with his right hand and a 10,000-meter-long streak of 5-colored sword light slashed open the sky in front of him. With a crisp cracking sound, a 1,000-kilometer-wide spatial rift was torn open in the sky thousands of kilometers in front of him. After the spatial crack, Taiyu God Emperor's space-sealing ability was greatly weakened. The 4 streaks of sword light descending from the sky were also blocked by the giant spatial crack. Boom boom boom. The 4 streaks of sword light struck the spatial crack at the same time, resulting in a deafening explosion. The space within 10,000 kilometers was completely shattered. Two of the streaks of sword light had run out of energy and collapsed on the spot, turning into countless shards of divine light that scattered in the spatial crack. As for the remaining two sword lights, they actually crossed the wide spatial crack and continued to slash towards Ji Tianxing. At the same time, Ji Tianxing's left index and middle fingers formed a sword and pointed at the two streaks of sword light twice. Whoosh whoosh. Two resplendent streaks of sword light shot out of his fingertips. They were almost tangible and pierced toward the two streaks of sword light like sharp swords. In the next moment, the four streaks of sword light clashed together, resulting in a deafening explosion that shook the world. A loud sound spread out for 50,000 kilometers. An incomparably violent force swept through the world like a hurricane, causing huge waves in the primal chaos sea to surge and sweep up 1,000 feet of waves. HF. Chapter 48:15. Ji Tianxing's sky-piercing finger and the two swords, which had exhausted most of their power, crumbled at the same time. Shards of divine light scattered in all directions, creating countless cracks in the sky as if they were weaving a giant net. Tai Yu God Emperor's attack was once again nullified by Ji Tianxing. The two sides were once again in a stalemate, with neither side gaining the upper hand. Tai Yu God Emperor's expression grew increasingly unsightly, and his eyes grew even more solemn. However, with his previous experience, he wasn't too surprised. He only swore to himself that he wouldn't let Ji Tianxing escape this time. He didn't wait for the divine light fragments to fall from the sky, nor did he wait for the waves of divine power to disperse. Instead, he used his second divine power and launched another attack. With a furious roar, he swung his divine sword again, unleashing 6 swords that locked onto Ji Tianxing's aura and targeted his vitals. As he attacked, he also split off a portion of his divine power to seal off space and suppress Ji Tianxing. Ji Tianxing was still enveloped by the invisible pressure and couldn't move an inch. He had considered dodging Tai Yu God Emperor's attack by stepping 300 meters to the left and diving into a spatial rift. However, that was far too dangerous, and the consequences were unknown. Once he passed through the spatial rift, he would leave the planet of origin and enter the outskirts of space. There was no telling where he would end up. At that time, returning to the planet of origin would be as difficult as ascending to the heavens. Of course, there was also the possibility that after passing through the spatial rift, he would fall into the chaotic mist of the planet of origin and become lost in the protective layer of the planet. He had already experienced the power of the chaotic mist. In any case, things hadn't progressed to that point yet, and he wasn't at the end of his rope yet. There was no way he would consider diving into a spatial rift. Looking at the 6 incoming swords, he gripped the sword of burial of heaven with both hands and stabbed forward with all his might. Sword of daylight. The burial of heaven sword flashed a cold light and disappeared in the sky. In the next moment, that cold light appeared 10,000 miles away and instantly expanded to 10,000 miles in radius. It released an incomparably dazzling golden light that was as resplendent as the scorching sun. Peng peng peng. The 6 sword lights that Tai Yu God Emperor unleashed with all his strength struck the sun, that was thousands of kilometers in radius, causing a series of muffled explosions. The enormous golden sun was crushed, turning into billions of golden light ribbons, light spots, and fragments, falling from the sky like a heavy downpour. This daylight sword was one of Ji Tianxing's strongest and most powerful moves. In the past, it had been used to deal with other God Emperors without fail. Now that he was using it against Tai Yu God Emperor, he couldn't threaten him at all. All he could do was neutralize and negate his attacks. What was even more infuriating was that even though the daylight sword had been destroyed, only 5 of the 6 sword lights had been destroyed. The remaining sword light had lost half of its power, but it was still extraordinarily powerful. It instantly arrived in front of Ji Tianxing. The sword light was only 100 miles away from Ji Tianxing. Given its speed, Ji Tianxing couldn't dodge it at all, nor could he use a second move to block it. He could only unleash all his power and form a thick divine light shield to block that sword. Kaboom! Just as the divine light shield was formed, the sword light that was thousands of feet long struck him, causing a loud and clear sound to ring out. The sword light and his divine light shield shattered at the same time, but he still didn't suffer much damage. However, the violent impact sent him flying a few hundred miles away. Tai Yu God Emperor still infused 3 strands of Daoist rhyme into the sword light, which pierced into Ji Tianxing's body like invisible thorns. This wasn't a repeat of the same trick. It was just a habit. After all, when Tai Yu God Emperor got serious, each of his attacks would be infused with several types of Daoist rhyme. On the surface, he appeared to be an upper-level God Emperor with 8 strands of Daoist rhyme, but in reality, he'd been at this level for 30,000 years and wasn't far from the 9th strand of Daoist rhyme. It was precisely because of this that he was able to defeat Ji Tianxing in all aspects, causing Ji Tianxing to be unable to defeat him, unable to escape, and completely unable to do anything. Whoosh! Ji Tianxing only forced out the 3 strands of Daoist rhyme after flying for more than 500 miles. Then he neutralized the impact and steadily stopped in the sky. The sea within tens of thousands of miles was stirred up. Giant waves thousands of feet high roared. The sky was filled with splashes and fragments of divine light. There were also raging winds and violent shockwaves. Before he could counterattack, Tai Yu God Emperor caught up and slashed out a 10,000-meter-long rainbow sword light. This sword light contained 7 types of Daoist rhyme and was extremely powerful. Even though the number of Daoist rhyme wasn't as great as the previous Daoist rhyme, this attack could really split heaven and earth. Even the sky was about to be sliced apart, let alone the chaos sea. As soon as the sword appeared, it locked onto Ji Tianxing's aura, causing him to feel immense pressure and the threat of death. He had nowhere to hide. He could only gather the power of the world and use his trump card again. Sword of Apocalypse. Ji Tianxing roared. He raised the sword of burial of heaven above his head and slashed at Tai Yu God Emperor. This was his most powerful attack. If he still couldn't neutralize Tai Yu God Emperor's attack, he would be powerless. Kaboom! A third of an instant later, the 2 giant swords that were also tens of thousands of feet long collided fiercely high in the sky, erupting with a deafening boom that shook the 9 heavens. One was a rainbow sword light while the other was a golden sword light. Both were extremely powerful. They could be considered the pinnacle techniques of Tai Yu God Emperor. What was interesting was that Tai Yu God Emperor's divine weapon was also a sword. Most of his Daoist rhyme had to do with swords. As for Ji Tianxing, he was known as the #1 sword Dao expert in the world. He was also known as Kenshin. Whose way of the sword was better? Whoosh! After an earth-shattering boom, the 2 swords exploded at the same time. Billions of shards of divine light shot out in all directions. The power of the explosion was so terrifying that a black hole with a radius of several thousand kilometers appeared in the sky. Through the black hole, one could vaguely see the dark void outside. Thick gray mist permeated the air. Thankfully, there were no spatial storms pouring in from the hole. Otherwise, the chaos sea would be even more chaotic. It wouldn't be as simple as just a massive wave. The terrifying shockwave carried countless fragments of divine light and spread out in all directions like ripples on the surface of a water. Tai Yu God Emperor's attack was neutralized again, and Ji Tianxing was still unharmed. However, he was still sent flying by the powerful shockwaves. His divine power was greatly depleted, and his aura became somewhat chaotic. This time, the power of the Dao seeped out of the shattered sword light, but he neutralized it in advance. It didn't penetrate his body. He had already been invaded twice by Tai Yu God Emperor's power of Dao. His meridians and blood vessels were damaged to varying degrees, and his strength was affected as well. If he were to be invaded twice more, it would be a light injury that would affect his combat prowess. Chapter 48:16. Ji Tianxing was sent flying again, but he was unscathed. Only his aura was a bit disordered. Tai Yu God Emperor's expression darkened even further. His eyes flashed with cold light and anger. At first, he attacked twice because he underestimated Ji Tianxing and didn't think much of him. That was why he was careless. However, ever since then, he had paid enough attention to Ji Tianxing, and had also used all his strength to cast spells in battle. In the end, it was useless. He couldn't even injure Ji Tianxing, let alone defeat or capture him. This dealt a heavy blow to Tai Yu God Emperor's confidence and dignity. He became angry out of humiliation. I'm the #1 expert of the continent of origin, but I can't do anything to this brat? Damn it. He doesn't look strong at all. Every time he dispels my abilities, he looks like he's having a hard time. Why is he always able to escape unscathed? Tai Yu God Emperor couldn't help but wonder if the brat was protected by the heavenly Dao because he was the chosen one. Otherwise, how could the brat create so many miracles? He was hunted down by the experts of the 2 temples and intercepted by the beast overlords of the unknown lands. In the end, he still managed to break out of the encirclement and escape into the Chaos Sea. Even he, the #1 expert of the continent of origin, couldn't do anything to him. This was too inconceivable. These thoughts flashed through his mind, but Tai Yu God Emperor didn't stop. He swung his divine sword at Ji Tianxing and launched another attack. He was patient enough to seal off the surrounding tens of thousands of kilometers and suppress Ji Tianxing. He continued to attack. He believed that no matter how deep Ji Tianxing's foundation was, he couldn't compare to him. Ji Tianxing wouldn't be able to last much longer. He would soon show signs of fatigue and his battle prowess would decline. Reverse Heavenly Splitter. Tai Yu God Emperor roared. He gripped his divine sword with both hands and swung it at Ji Tianxing from the bottom left. This sword strike was different from the norm, but it was still one of Tai Yu God Emperor's ultimate moves. God Emperor Tai Yu could cast spells like this for half a day without stopping. However, Ji Tianxing had just used his trump card. Now, there were no other moves that could counter this sacred art. It was impossible for him to use the Sword of Extinction again. However, other than the Armageddon Sword, he didn't have any other skills that could block this attack. It's over. In the end, the difference in strength is too great. He's going to be defeated so quickly. This thought flashed through Ji Tianxing's mind. He had already predicted the consequences. However, he would never admit defeat, nor would he give up. Even if he knew that he was no match for his opponent, he would still give it his all. Sword breaking 9 heavens. With a furious roar, he gripped the sword of burial of heaven with both hands and unleashed all of his power, thrusting it toward Tai Yu God Emperor. Suddenly, a giant dark golden sword that was 3,000 feet long flashed through the sky with the power to pierce through everything. A quarter of an instant later, the dark golden sword struck Tai Yu God Emperor's sword light. Kaboom! The sword light clashed, and another crisp sound rang out, reverberating throughout the world. The terrifying force of the impact caused the sea within tens of thousands of miles to undulate, and huge waves to rise and fall. Billions of shards of divine light bloomed like fireworks, raining down from the sky in a dazzling display. However, the outcome this time was different from before. The only thing that was shattered was the giant dark golden sword that was 3,000 feet long. Tai Yu God Emperor's sword light didn't shatter. It just dimmed a lot, and its power weakened. However, it still streaked across the sky like a bolt of lightning and struck Ji Tianxing. Boom! Ji Tianxing couldn't dodge, nor was he able to counter it in time. At this critical moment, he could only hold the sword of burial of heaven with both hands and block in front of him. At the same time, he used his divine power to form a barrier of divine light, raising his defense to the maximum. And these methods were immediately effective. With a crisp shattering sound, his divine light shield was shattered into countless pieces. Then, the giant sword light engulfed him and struck the sword of burial of heaven, sending him flying. He tumbled dozens of times in the sky before crashing into the ocean several hundred miles away like a cannonball. The terrifying sword intent and impact tore apart his clothes, messed up his hair, and caused blood to spurt out of his body. Even though his divine body had been tempered countless times and was extremely tough, it couldn't withstand the sword energy. In the end, several bloody grooves were left on his arms, chest, and face. Golden divine blood splattered across the sky. Ji Tianxing was also struck by the violent energy. His internal organs were shaken, and blood seeped out of the corner of his mouth. However, he clenched his teeth and didn't make a sound. After retreating 600 miles, he finally managed to neutralize the impact and stopped in the sky. His steps were still as steady as rocks, and his figure was still as straight as a sword. However, his face was a bit pale, and his chest was heaving up and down. He didn't say anything. Instead, he swallowed the blood surging up his throat and circulated his energy to suppress the chaotic divine power. The result was similar to what he'd expected. He did his best to neutralize Tai Yu God Emperor's attack, but he was still injured. Fortunately, it was only a light injury that slightly affected his combat ability. However, this was only the beginning. Tai Yu God Emperor didn't give him any time to catch his breath. He took another step and crossed several thousand miles, charging 5,000 miles ahead of him and slashing with his sword again. Ji Tianxing had just calmed his divine power and didn't even have time to suppress his injuries before he had to grit his teeth and fight again. Helpless, he could only ignore his injuries and do his best to resist Tai Yu God Emperor's attacks. In the next 10 breaths of time, Tai Yu God Emperor attacked 12 times in a row. His attacks were like raging waves, coming one after another, each stronger than the one before. He unleashed an imposing and domineering aura, as well as the aura of an unrivaled expert. However, Ji Tianxing could only block and retreat again. He tried his best to neutralize the attacks, but there was no way he could face them head-on. 10 breaths later, Ji Tianxing had been pushed back 15,000 miles. Several more wounds had appeared on his body, and the injuries to his internal organs and meridians were even more severe. His clothes were tattered and stained with blood. His long hair draped over his shoulders, covering his pale face and the blood at the corner of his mouth. If he didn't find a way to break free from Tai Yu God Emperor, he would continue to be suppressed until he ran out of energy and was completely defeated. Tai Yu God Emperor's anger had been vented, and he felt extremely carefree. He was no longer in a hurry to defeat Ji Tianxing. All he wanted to do now was to suppress his opponent and force him into a corner step by step. He wanted to make his opponent surrender in despair until he begged for mercy. Only then would he be able to live up to all the effort he had put into hunting him down for billions of miles. However, just as Tai Yu God Emperor was about to unleash a torrential barrage of attacks, numerous giant figures emerged from the surrounding waves. You're tuning in to the Wang Lin's Journey YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.